Why do we fear death more than we fear life itself? Fear of death is universal yet deeply paradoxical. Most of us live through endless cycles of pain, suffering, and disappointment. But the idea of leaving it all behind terrifies us. Why? Is it the loss of existence, the unknown that looms beyond, or something even more profound that we fail to put into words? At its core, the fear of death is tied to the unknown. Humans are creatures of habit and understanding. We thrive on explanations, asking why the sky is blue, why fire burns, and why life is hard. But death offers none. It stands as the ultimate mystery, an abyss that resists our attempts to define or conquer it. We might try to soften its edges with religion, science, or philosophy, but these are only guesses and comforting stories we tell ourselves to make the inevitable feel less daunting. But let us look deeper. Is it just the mystery of death that scares us, or is it the possibility that we do not matter in the end? The idea that our lives, filled with love, hate, triumph, and failure, might dissolve into nothingness is perhaps even more terrifying than death itself. If all our struggles lead to the same outcome, was there ever any point to begin with? Yet, here is the twist. Our fear of death is not purely philosophical. It is deeply biological. Our survival instincts have been hardwired over millions of years to keep us alive. Evolution does not care about your existential crisis. It just wants you to live long enough to reproduce and ensure the continuation of your genetic code. Fear of death is not a flaw. It is a feature. It is what kept your ancestors from walking off cliffs or swimming in waters teeming with predators. Your fear is your body's way of saying, stay alive at all costs. But this creates a strange paradox. We are afraid of death because we are wired to value survival, yet many aspects of life are inherently terrifying. Life can be brutal, filled with betrayal, disease, heartbreak, and the crushing weight of knowing we are ultimately powerless in the grand scheme of things. If life is so hard, why not embrace the end? Why not let go of the fear? This is where society plays its hand. Fear of death is deeply cultural. We live in a world that idealizes youth, productivity, and legacy. To age is to decline, and to die is to fail. Every anti-aging cream, gym membership, and motivational speech is a subtle reminder that death is the enemy. It is a silent force pushing us to outrun the Reaper, even when we know he is always a step ahead. And then there is religion. For centuries, spiritual beliefs have shaped our relationship with death. Concepts like heaven, hell, and reincarnation are not just answers to the unknown. They are tools of control. If you fear death because of the eternal punishment that might follow, you are more likely to conform to societal norms, obey authority, and live a moral life. In this way, death does not just loom as a personal fear, it becomes a societal weapon used to keep us in line. But not all cultures see death as something to be feared. In some traditions, death is celebrated as a transition, not an end. The Day of the Dead in Mexico, for example, turns mourning into a vibrant festival where families honor their departed loved ones with music, food, and laughter. In this context, death is not the enemy, it is a part of life, a moment to reflect on what was and to cherish what remains. So, what about you? What is it that makes your palms sweat and your heart race when you think of your final moments? Is it the pain of dying itself? Most people imagine death as an agonizing process, a slow fading into oblivion. But the truth is, death is not always violent. Many people die peacefully, slipping away as if into a dream. Yet, even this does not bring comfort. Because it is not the act of dying that terrifies us, it is the awareness of its inevitability. Imagine, for a moment, that you were immortal. You could live forever, dodging death for eternity. Would your fear vanish, or would it transform into something even darker? Immortality sounds appealing, but it raises unsettling questions. Would life lose its meaning without an endpoint? Would the weight of infinite time crush your desire to live at all? Perhaps our fear of death is not just about losing life, but also about what life becomes when death is removed. The truth is, we fear death because it forces us to confront our limitations. We like to believe we are in control, that our choices matter, that we can shape our destinies. But death laughs in the face of control. It is the great equalizer, the one thing we cannot escape, outwit, or bargain with. And maybe that is the scariest part of all, not the unknown, not the pain, but the sheer helplessness of it. Yet, there is beauty in this fear. It reminds us that we are alive. Every time your heart races at the thought of death, it is a reminder that is still beating. The fear of death, paradoxically, is what makes life so precious. Without it, would we strive, love, or dream? Would we hold our loved ones a little tighter, knowing that someday we will have to let go? In the end, to fear death is to be human. It is a reminder of our fragility, our resilience, and the strange bittersweet gift of being alive in a world that guarantees our demise. Perhaps we do not fear death as much as we fear the idea of not living enough before it comes. What does it truly mean to die? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. Death is the moment when your body stops working, your heart ceases to beat, and your brain shuts down. But is it really that simple? Does death occur in an instant, or is it a process? Is it purely biological, or does it also have emotional, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions? At its core, death challenges our understanding of existence. The line between life and death is often blurred. For example, consider brain death, a state in which the body is technically alive, but consciousness is gone. Is someone in this state truly dead, even if their heart still beats with the help of machines? Or take the opposite case. People who have no vital signs, but are revived by modern medicine. Were they dead? Did they return from the other side, or did they never fully cross over? These questions reveal the complexity of defining death. It is not just about the absence of life. It is about the transition from one state of being to another. And this transition is something we understand far less than we think. Biologically, death is a process, not a single moment. After your heart stops beating, your cells begin to die, but not all at once. Some cells, particularly those in your brain, can survive for several minutes, sometimes longer. This is why there is a small window in which resuscitation is possible. But even when the body is beyond saving, it does not immediately shut down. Processes like rigor mortis and decomposition are reminders that death unfolds gradually, like the fading of a flame. But biology only tells part of the story. Death is not just about what happens to the body. It is also about what happens to the self. When you die, what becomes of you? Your memories, your consciousness, your sense of identity. Do they vanish the moment your brain ceases to function? Or is there something more? Something that survives the death of the body? Different cultures and philosophies offer wildly different answers. Some believe in an immortal soul, a part of you that lives on in another realm. Others see death as a return to the earth, a dissolution of the self into the universe. Still others argue that you are nothing more than the sum of your brain's electrical activity. Once that activity ceases, you cease to exist. But here is where it gets even more complicated. What if death is not a singular event, but something that happens in stages? Consider this. There is physical death, when your body ceases to function. But there is also social death, when people stop acknowledging your existence. This can happen long before your biological death. Think of someone ostracized, forgotten, or abandoned by society. And then there is existential death, the loss of purpose or meaning in life. Can someone who feels utterly disconnected from themselves and the world be said to be alive in the truest sense? This idea of death as a multi-layered phenomenon forces us to reconsider what it means to live. Are you truly alive if you are merely going through the motions, without connection or purpose? And if not, does that mean death begins long before the body gives out? Let us explore another angle. The moment of death. Many people who have had near-death experiences describe it as peaceful, even euphoric. A sensation of leaving the body, moving toward a light, or feeling an overwhelming sense of love and acceptance. But skeptics argue that these experiences are simply the brain's way of coping with extreme stress, a flood of chemicals creating vivid hallucinations. So, which is it? Is the moment of death a profound transition to another plane of existence, or just a final burst of neural fireworks? And what about the fear of being forgotten? For many, the true terror of death is not the physical process. It is the idea of fading into obscurity. We fight against this in countless ways. Creating art, building legacies, passing down stories. We do not just fear the end of our lives. We fear the erasure of our impact. The idea that the world will move on as if we were never here. But here is a question that might haunt you. What if we are already dead in some sense? Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus have argued that to live without meaning is to experience a kind of death while still breathing. And then there is the unsettling possibility that life itself is an illusion, a simulation, a dream, or a fleeting ripple in a vast, indifferent universe. If that is true, what does it mean to die in a reality that might not be real? There is also the matter of acceptance. Many spiritual traditions teach that to truly live, you must come to terms with death. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, describes death as an opportunity, a chance to escape the cycle of suffering and attain enlightenment. In this view, death is not an ending. It is a doorway. But how many of us are ready to step through it? Ultimately, to die is to confront the ultimate mystery. It is a reminder that no matter how much we learn, some questions will remain unanswered. And perhaps that is the point. If we understood death completely, would it lose its power? Would it cease to inspire the awe, fear, and wonder that make us human? So, what does it mean to die? Maybe it is not just about the end of life. Maybe it is about the boundaries we set between life and death, self and other, existence and oblivion. And maybe, just maybe, those boundaries are not as solid as we think. Does death give life its only meaning or steal it entirely? Death is a paradox. It is the ultimate destroyer, erasing everything we build, every memory we make, and every trace of who we were. Yet, for many, it is the very thing that gives life its meaning. How can something so final and unforgiving be both the thief of purpose and its greatest source? To understand this contradiction, we must first ask, what is the meaning of life without death? Imagine a world where you are immortal, not just for a century, but forever. In this hypothetical eternity, every experience can be repeated and every choice reversed. Would life feel meaningful, or would it become an endless loop of monotony? After all, if you have infinite time to do everything, does anything truly matter? This is the heart of the argument that death gives life meaning. It places a boundary on our existence and forces us to prioritize. The fleeting nature of time creates urgency. Love is sweeter because it is finite. Achievements feel significant because they occur against the ticking clock of mortality. The awareness of death sharpens, like a blade honing itself against impermanence. But is this all an illusion? Are we simply tricking ourselves into finding meaning in a cruel joke played by the universe? Death does not just limit our time, it also mocks our efforts. No matter how hard we strive, all will eventually fade. The empires we build will crumble, the art we create will turn to dust, and the memories of our existence will vanish. Death erases everything, leaving only silence. How can meaning survive such obliteration? Philosopher Albert Camus confronted this very question in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, represents the absurdity of human existence. No matter how hard we work, the end is the same. The boulder rolls back down. Yet, Camus argues, there is defiance in choosing to keep pushing. By embracing the absurd, we create our own meaning in the face of meaninglessness. But this defiance is not for everyone. For many, the knowledge of death is a burden, a shadow that looms over every joy. How can you truly savor a sunset when you know it is one of a finite number you will ever see? How can love not feel fragile, knowing it will one day end? For these people, death does not give life meaning, it strips it away, turning every moment into a countdown. Consider this: if death gives life meaning, why do we fight so hard against it? Entire industries are built around the fear of death. Anti-aging products, fitness routines, diets, and cryogenics are all fueled by the desperate desire to delay the inevitable. Even the way we talk about death reveals our resistance. We say someone lost the battle against illness, as if dying is a failure. If death truly gives life meaning, why do we not welcome it as a natural and necessary conclusion? Perhaps it is because the meaning death gives is not comforting. It is a meaning built on scarcity and on the idea that life is precious precisely because it is fragile. This is not the kind of meaning that consoles us on a dark night or in a hospital room. It is the cold, unfeeling truth that we cling to because the alternative, believing life is meaningless, is too unbearable. But there is another way to see it. Death does not just limit life, it frames it. It provides contrast. Imagine a painting with no borders. It would spill endlessly into nothingness, losing its form. Death is the border that gives life shape, allowing us to see its beauty and tragedy clearly. Without it, life would be a blur, an undefined mess with no beginning or end. Yet even this framing is not universal. Different cultures and philosophies have wildly different interpretations of death's role in giving life meaning. For the Stoics, the awareness of death is a tool to live better. Memento Mori, remember you must die, is not a threat but a reminder to focus on what truly matters. By keeping death close, they argue, we can free ourselves from petty concerns and live authentically. In contrast, certain Eastern philosophies see death as an illusion. In Buddhism, for example, the cycle of life and death samsara is seen as a trap, something to transcend. In this view, clinging to life's meaning is itself a source of suffering. Only by letting go, by accepting the impermanence of all things, can we find true peace. But what about legacy? For many, the answer to death's erasure is to leave something behind: a child, a book, a building, a revolution. Legacy offers the illusion of immortality, a way to outlive our bodies. Yet, even legacies fade. Cities fall, books are forgotten, and revolutions are rewritten by history. Is it enough to be remembered for a time, or does true meaning require permanence? Perhaps the answer lies in how we choose to live in the face of death. If death is the end, then the meaning of life must come from within it, not beyond it. It is found in the connections we make, the risks we take, and the moments we fully inhabit. It is in laughing with friends, holding someone you love, or simply watching the wind move through the trees. So, does death give life its only meaning, or does it steal every bit of it? Maybe it does both. Maybe that is the paradox we have to live with, that meaning and meaninglessness coexist, intertwined like strands of DNA. Death is the shadow that makes the light more vivid, the silence that gives music its rhythm, the absence that makes presence feel real. In the end, perhaps the question is not whether life meaning, but whether we are brave enough to find meaning despite it. Is death the only choice we don't get to make? Choice defines our lives. From the mundane, what to eat for breakfast, to the monumental, whom to love, where to live, what to believe. Our identities are shaped by the decisions we make. Yet, there is one choice no one gets to make, that is whether to die. No matter how much freedom we think we have, death is the inescapable conclusion to our stories. But is death truly an inevitable fact, or do we have more control over it than we realize? Let's start with the simple truth. Death is universal. No amount of wealth, power, or knowledge can buy exemption from mortality. Every king, prophet, and revolutionary has met the same fate as the beggar and the thief. In this sense, death is the great equalizer, stripping us of all status and forcing us to confront our shared fragility. But does this universality make it any less a choice? Consider the moments in life when people do seem to have a choice in facing death. Take the act of suicide, often regarded as the ultimate assertion of control over one's mortality. For those who choose this path, death becomes less of an inevitability and more of a decision. It is not an easy or light choice, but it is a choice nonetheless. An act of defiance against the idea that we must passively await death's arrival. But even this choice is limited. Many who consider ending their lives are not acting out of freedom but out of despair, their options constrained by suffering, illness, or hopelessness. In such cases, the choice to die is less about agency and more about an escape from unbearable circumstances. So, is it really a choice if it arises from the absence of better alternatives? Then there is the medical frontier. Advances in technology have made it possible to delay death in ways our ancestors could never imagine. Life support, organ transplants, and experimental treatments allow us to push the boundaries of mortality. But these advances come with their own set of ethical dilemmas. Who decides when enough is enough? Is refusing life-saving treatment a choice to embrace death, or simply an acceptance of its inevitability? Euthanasia and assisted dying add another layer to this discussion. In countries where these practices are legal, individuals suffering from terminal illnesses are given the power to choose the timing and manner of their deaths. For them, death is no longer a passive event, but an active decision, a way to reclaim dignity in the face of suffering. Yet, even this so-called choice is bound by laws, societal norms, and medical restrictions. How much freedom do we truly have when our choices are so heavily regulated? But let us go deeper. Beyond the practicalities of choosing or delaying death, there is a larger question. Do we ever truly have free will over life and death? Philosophers have debated this for centuries. If the universe operates on deterministic principles, where every action is the result of prior causes, then even the decisions we think we make about life and death are not truly ours. Under this view, the moment of our death as predetermined as the moment of our birth. And yet, there is another perspective that suggests the opposite, that life itself is an ongoing act of choosing against death. Every breath, every meal, every decision to get out of bed in the morning is, in its own way, a choice to live. We may not control the fact of our eventual death, but we can choose how we respond to it, whether we live in fear of it, accept it, or resist it at every turn. But what about the choices we do not realize we are making? Consider the risks we take every day. Driving a car, crossing a busy street, or even something as simple as eating unhealthy food. Each of these actions carries a small but real risk of death. In a way, we are constantly gambling with our lives, choosing to prioritize convenience or pleasure over safety. We do not often think of these actions as choices about death, but they are. There is also the question of how we define death itself. In some cultures, death is not the end of existence, but a transition, a choice to leave one plane of being and move to another. This view suggests that death is not the absence of choice, but the ultimate choice, the decision to let go, to move on, to embrace whatever lies beyond. Yet, for most of us, death feels like the one thing over which we have no control. No matter how much we achieve, how carefully we plan, or how fervently we hope, death is the final boundary we cannot cross on our own terms. It is a reminder that we are not as powerful as we like to believe, that no matter how many choices we make in life, the ultimate choice is out of our hands. But perhaps that is not entirely true. If death is inevitable, then the real choice lies in how we face it. Do we approach it with fear and resistance, clinging to life at all costs? Do we accept it with grace, seeing it as a natural part of the human experience? Or do we embrace it as an opportunity, a chance to let go of the burdens of existence and find peace? In the end, death may be the only choice we do not get to make, but it also defines every choice we do. It is the shadow that shapes our lives, giving weight to our actions and urgency to our dreams. And while we cannot escape it, perhaps we can learn to live with it, not as an enemy, but as a companion on the journey to meaning. What actually awaits us beyond the curtain? Death is the ultimate enigma. For centuries, humanity has peered into the void, asking what happens after we die. Is there something waiting beyond the curtain? Or is death the end of consciousness, a final fade into nothingness? This question has inspired religions, haunted philosophers, and confounded scientists. Despite all our technological advancements and intellectual progress, the afterlife or the absence of it remains a mystery that no one can definitively answer. The most common answer to this question comes from religion. Nearly every faith tradition offers a vision of what lies beyond death, and these visions are as varied as they are vivid. In Christianity, for instance, heaven and hell represent two extremes: eternal bliss for the righteous and unending torment for the wicked. Hinduism and Buddhism, on the other hand, present a more cyclical view. Death is not the end but a transition, a movement into a new life through reincarnation, governed by the karma one accumulates. Ancient Egyptian beliefs envisioned an elaborate journey through the underworld, where the soul's worth was weighed against a feather. But here is the problem. How do we know any of this is true? These interpretations rely on faith, not evidence. For those without religious convictions, these stories may feel like comforting myths, a way to make sense of the senseless. Still, even skeptics find themselves wondering, could the persistence of afterlife beliefs across cultures point to something deeper? Could they be echoes of some fundamental truth we have forgotten? Science approaches the question from a very different angle. According to neuroscience, consciousness arises from the brain. When the brain stops functioning, consciousness should cease as well. This view suggests that death is not a transition but an end, a blackout from which there is no awakening. For many, this idea is terrifying. The thought of one's self, memories, personality, awareness, simply ceasing to exist is almost impossible to comprehend. After all, how can you imagine nothingness when imagination itself is a function of being alive? And yet, there are phenomena that science struggles to explain. Near-death experiences are among the most compelling. People who have been clinically dead, without a heartbeat, without brain activity, sometimes report astonishingly vivid encounters upon being revived. They describe tunnels of light, reunions with deceased loved ones, feelings of overwhelming peace, and even a sense of leaving their bodies. Skeptics argue that these experiences are the result of dying brains flooding with chemicals, creating hallucinations. But believers see them as glimpses of the afterlife. What is intriguing is that near-death experiences often share strikingly similar elements regardless of the experiencer's cultural or religious background. This consistency raises an unsettling question. Are these experiences universal because they reflect a biological process, or because they reveal something genuine about what awaits us? Beyond near-death experiences, quantum physics has also contributed to the conversation, albeit indirectly. Some physicists propose that consciousness might not be entirely tied to the brain. Theories like quantum consciousness suggest that the mind could exist on a fundamental level within the universe, independent of the body. If this is true, death might not mean the annihilation of the self, but a return to a larger cosmic reality, a perspective that aligns surprisingly well with certain spiritual traditions. But even if consciousness continues in some form after death, what would that feel like? Could it be an endless dream, a state of pure awareness, or something beyond human comprehension? Here is where philosophy enters the picture. The 20th century thinker, Thomas Nagel, famously asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" His point was that we can never truly understand the subjective experience of another being. If this is true for bats, it is even more true for the dead. Whatever lies beyond may be so radically different from life that we cannot begin to grasp it from this side of existence. Then there is the possibility that nothing awaits us. This is perhaps the most unsettling idea of all. That death is a void, a complete cessation of experience. For some, this is a source of despair. But others, like philosopher Epicurus, argue that we have no reason to fear oblivion. Death is nothing to us, he wrote, for when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. In other words, the absence of awareness means there will be no pain, no regret, no fear, only silence. Yet, humanity's fascination with the afterlife persists. Why? Perhaps it is because we crave continuity. The thought of losing everything, the people we love, the memories we have made, the identity we have built, is too much to bear. Imagining an afterlife gives us hope that something of us endures. Even those who reject traditional religious views often create their own visions of what might come next. A merging with the universe, a rebirth as energy, or even a continuation of existence in a digital form through future technology. Ultimately, the question of what awaits us beyond the curtain may remain unanswered until we step through it ourselves. And perhaps that is for the best. The mystery keeps us searching, imagining, and questioning. It forces us to grapple with the nature of existence and the meaning of life. So, what lies beyond? Heaven or hell? Reincarnation or oblivion? A great cosmic reality or an eternal void? We do not know, and that is the beauty of it. The unknown is what gives life its edge, its urgency, and its wonder. Whether death is a doorway or a dead end, it is the question itself that shapes how we live. Why do we mourn the dead? Mourning is one of the most universal yet profoundly personal human experiences. Across cultures and eras, we gather to weep, remember, and honor those we've lost. But why do we mourn the dead? At its surface, grief seems like a biological paradox. It doesn't bring the deceased back, nor does it offer any tangible survival advantage. And yet, we grieve deeply, loudly, and with rituals that shape societies. What is it about death that commands such emotional devotion? At its core, mourning is about connection. Humans are social creatures, and our lives are defined by relationships. When someone dies, that connection is severed abruptly, leaving an emotional void that our brains struggle to process. In mourning, we're not just reacting to their absence. We're trying to reconcile the fact that the world continues to turn without them in it. Mourning is, in a sense, a rebellion against the cold indifference of existence. But grief is more than a simple reaction to loss. It's an acknowledgement of what was and what will never be again. Mourning forces us to confront the impermanence of life, the fleeting nature of love, time, and memory. In this way, it is both deeply painful and profoundly beautiful. To mourn is to say, "You mattered," even as the universe insists that nothing lasts forever. The act of mourning also serves a communal purpose. Funerals, memorials, and wakes are not just for the dead. They're for the living. These rituals create a space where grief can be shared, where the weight of loss is distributed among friends and family. In mourning together, we reaffirm the bonds of community and remind ourselves that we are not alone in our pain. The rituals vary widely. Some cultures wail and scream, others sit in silent reflection. But the purpose is the same, to make sense of the senseless. Consider how mourning is shaped by culture. In Western traditions, grief often carries a private, somber tone. Black clothes, hushed voices, and restrained tears are common. In contrast, cultures like those in Ghana celebrate the dead with vibrant colors, music, and dancing. Día de los Muertos in Mexico turns mourning into a joyful remembrance, with altars adorned in marigolds and offerings to loved ones. In Tibetan Buddhism, death is seen as a transition, and mourning is a way to guide the soul through the bardo, the space between life and rebirth. These differences highlight an important truth. Mourning is as much about the living as it is about the dead. How we grieve reflects our beliefs about life, death, and what comes after. For those who believe in an afterlife, mourning is tempered by hope. For atheists or skeptics, grief is often rawer, tinged with the finality of loss. But in every case, mourning serves as a bridge, a way to carry the memory of the deceased forward into the lives of those left behind. On a psychological level, grief is both a necessity and a challenge. Sigmund Freud called mourning a process of decathexis, where the mourner slowly detaches their emotional energy from the deceased and reinvests it in the living. But this is easier said than done. Grief is not a linear process. It ebbs and flows, sometimes receding into quiet sadness, other times crashing over us like a wave. The famous 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are often cited as a framework for understanding mourning. But these stages oversimplify the experience. Grief is messy, unpredictable, and deeply individual. Some people grieve for years, while others seem to move on quickly. Some cry every day, while others never shed a tear. There is no right way to mourn, and that's part of what makes it so deeply human. But there's another layer to mourning that goes beyond personal or cultural practices: the existential weight of grief. When someone close to us dies, it's not just their death we're mourning, it's a reminder of our own mortality. Their absence becomes a mirror, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that one day, we too will be mourned. In this way, grief is both intimate and universal, deeply tied to the human condition. And yet, mourning is also an act of creation. In remembering the dead, we keep their stories alive. Every photo we preserve, every anecdote we share, every song that reminds us of them is a way of saying, "You are not forgotten." Mourning transforms loss into legacy, ensuring that the dead continue to exist in some form, if only in our memories. But what happens when we don't mourn? In some cases, unresolved grief can fester, manifesting as anger, depression, or even physical illness. Without the rituals of mourning, we struggle to process loss, leaving us trapped in a state of emotional limbo. This is why mourning is not just a natural response to death, it's a necessary one. Ultimately, we mourn because we love. A grief is the price we pay for the connections that make life meaningful. To mourn someone is to honor them, to say, "Your life mattered, and your absence is felt." It's a reminder that even in death, relationships endure. So, why do we mourn the dead? Because mourning is what makes us human. It's how we face the unfaceable, how we find meaning in the midst of loss, and how we carry the memory of those we've loved into a future they can no longer inhabit. In mourning, we find not only pain, but also a testament to the power of love, a love strong enough to reach beyond the grave. What if death is a lie we've been told since birth? What if everything we believe about death is wrong? What if the very idea of death as an absolute end, or even a transition, is a lie? A construct we've been fed since birth to make sense of a universe we don't fully understand. This question may sound like the start of a conspiracy theory, but it forces us to consider something deeply unsettling. What if our understanding of death is just a story, a framework created to cope with the incomprehensible? The first step in unraveling this possibility is to question what death really is. We've been taught to see it as the cessation of life, a moment where the body stops functioning and the spark of consciousness is extinguished. But what if that's just an illusion? After all, every cell in your body will continue to exist long after you die, breaking down and rejoining the cycle of nature. In a sense, parts of you are never truly gone. You are scattered, repurposed, recycled but not erased. Could this mean death, as we understand it, is merely a transformation, not an end? Consider consciousness. Modern science ties it to the brain, arguing that when the brain dies, consciousness vanishes. But this theory raises more questions than it answers. Despite decades of research, neuroscientists still don't fully understand how consciousness arises in the first place. If we can't explain what consciousness is, how can we be certain that it ceases with the brain? Some researchers suggest that consciousness might not be tied to the brain at all, that it could exist independently, like a signal that the brain tunes into, rather than generates. If this is true, death might not be the silencing of consciousness, but merely a change in its form or location. Even more intriguing are ideas from quantum physics. Some theories suggest that the universe itself is fundamentally interconnected, and that information, once created, can never be destroyed. If human consciousness is a form of information, could it persist in some way after physical death? Concepts like quantum entanglement and the holographic principle hint at a reality far stranger than anything we currently understand. Perhaps death is not the end of you, but a shift into a different state of existence, one that lies beyond the grasp of our senses. And what about the near-death experiences reported by thousands of people worldwide? These accounts often describe vivid sensations, traveling through tunnels of light, encountering deceased loved ones, or feeling a profound sense of peace and unity. Skeptics argue these experiences are the result of a dying brain releasing chemicals or firing random signals. But there's a problem with this explanation. Many near-death experiences occur in patients whose brains are clinically dead, with no measurable activity. If their consciousness was nothing more than electrical signals, how could they have these experiences without a functioning brain? Then there's the cultural element. Humans have been telling stories about death for millennia, and these stories shape how we perceive it. Ancient Egyptians believed death was a journey through the underworld, guided by spells and rituals. Vikings imagined Valhalla, where warriors feasted eternally. Modern religions promise heavens and hells, reincarnations and karmic cycles. But what if these narratives are just that, stories? Could it be that our fear of death has driven us to invent explanations, to impose meaning on something we can't comprehend? Or perhaps the stories are not entirely invented. What if they're echoes of something real, glimpses of a truth we've forgotten? Some philosophers suggest that our obsession with death is a sign that it's not what it seems. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras, for example, believed in the transmigration of souls, a cycle of death and rebirth that hinted at a deeper continuity. More recently, philosophers like Alan Watts have argued that death and life are not opposites, but part of the same process, like the crest and trough of a wave. Let's take this a step further. What if death doesn't exist at all? The idea might sound absurd, but some thinkers argue that the concept of death is a construct, an artificial boundary we've created to make sense of our limited perspective. After all, what is death but a change in form? Energy doesn't disappear, it transforms. Ice melts into water, water evaporates into vapor. Could our existence follow the same principle, transitioning from one state to another in ways we can't yet perceive? There's also the unsettling possibility that we're already dead in some sense. What if life as we know it is a simulation, a dream, or a test? Some interpretations of Eastern philosophy suggest that what we call life is an illusion, a temporary state of ignorance that hides our true, infinite nature. If this is the case, death might not be an ending but an awakening, a return to a reality more real than the one we experience now. Of course, there's no way to know for certain. That's the maddening, humbling truth about death. It remains a mystery, no matter how much we theorize or speculate. But perhaps that's the point. Death challenges us to confront the limits of our understanding, to embrace the unknown. It forces us to ask questions that have no answers, to stretch our minds in ways that remind us of how little we truly know. So, what if death is a lie? What if everything we've been told is wrong? Whether death is an end, a transition, or an illusion, one thing is clear: our understanding of it is incomplete. And maybe that's the greatest gift death gives us, the chance to wonder, to question, and to imagine what lies beyond the curtain. Why are humans obsessed with legacy? The idea of legacy haunts humanity. Whether it's leaving behind a groundbreaking invention, writing a book that stands the test of time, raising a family, or simply being remembered by friends, we crave permanence in a world where everything fades. But why? Why do we, as fleeting beings, care so deeply about leaving something behind after we're gone? At first glance, legacy seems like a defiance of death, a way to outlast our mortal bodies. We know we're going to die, but through legacy, we hope to cheat oblivion. This is why monuments are erected, names are carved into stone, and wealth is passed down through generations. Legacy gives us the illusion of immortality. Even if our bodies return to dust, we believe our actions, creations, or influence will keep us alive in the memories of others. But is this obsession with legacy an act of desperation? After all, most legacies are short-lived. Think about it. How many of us can name our great-great-grandparents? Their lives, hopes, and struggles have likely been forgotten, even by their own bloodline. And what about the countless billions of people whose names were never written down, whose stories were never told? Does this mean their lives were meaningless, simply because they left no trace? This stark reality begs the question: is legacy truly about being remembered? Or is it more about the comfort it brings while we're alive? Knowing we've contributed something to the world, however small, helps us feel significant. It gives us purpose, a sense of belonging to something larger than ourselves. In this way, legacy is less about the future and more about calming our present fears. Evolution might also play a role in our obsession with legacy. From a biological perspective, the drive to pass on our genes is hardwired into us. Legacy, in this sense, is survival by proxy. Even if we don't live forever, our offspring, or the things we create, ensure that some part of us continues. This primal instinct is why so many people feel a deep sense of purpose in raising children or creating works that outlive them. But legacy isn't just about survival. It's also about control. Death strips us of all agency, But legacy gives us the illusion of shaping the future. By leaving something behind, we exert influence over a time we will never see. This desire for control explains why some people are willing to sacrifice so much for their legacy, spending their lives building empires, creating art, or pursuing fame, even if it comes at the cost of happiness or relationships. Still, there's a darker side to legacy. For some, the obsession with being remembered becomes an all-consuming fixation. History is filled with figures who sought to carve their names into eternity through conquest, destruction, or infamy. Think of the rulers who built colossal monuments to themselves, the tyrants who sought to rewrite history, or even the modern celebrities who go to extremes for attention. These pursuits often raise the question, at what cost do we chase legacy? And what happens when legacy fails? There's a tragic irony in realizing that even the most celebrated legacies eventually fade. Empires crumble, statues erode, and once revered names become footnotes in history. The Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest repositories of knowledge, was destroyed, and with it, countless legacies were lost forever. In the grand cosmic timeline, is any legacy truly permanent? But maybe permanence isn't the point. Some argue that legacy isn't about eternity but impact. It's less about being remembered forever and more about the ripples we create during our time. Think of it like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples eventually fade, but they change the water, however briefly. Perhaps our actions, no matter how small, shape the lives of others in ways we'll never fully understand. Consider this: every word you speak, every gesture you make, every choice you take sends ripples into the lives of those around you. These ripples extend outward, influencing people you may never meet. Maybe the teacher who inspired you to follow your dreams had no idea how deeply they impacted you. Maybe the kindness of a stranger changed the course of your day and your life. These are legacies, even if they're invisible. Legacy can also be seen as an act of hope. To leave something behind is to believe in a future worth shaping, even if you won't be there to see it. This hope drives innovation, art, and social change. It's what inspires people to plant trees whose shade they'll never sit under, or to fight for causes they'll never personally benefit from. Legacy, in this sense, is a gift we give to the unknown. And yet, there's a profound freedom in letting go of legacy. When we release the need to be remembered, we can focus fully on the present. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "You don't have to justify yourself or your existence by leaving a legacy. You are enough simply by being." This perspective challenges the notion that our worth is tied to what we leave behind. It suggests that life's meaning isn't in what we build for the future, but in how we live today. So, why are humans obsessed with legacy? Perhaps it's because we know, deep down, how fragile and temporary we are. Legacy is our answer to mortality, a way to say, "I was here." But maybe the truest legacy isn't a monument, a name, or a story. Maybe it's the lives we touch, the love we give, and the ways we make the world, however briefly, a little brighter. In the end, whether your legacy is remembered for 1,000 years or forgotten in a generation, the impact you make in the lives of others is real. And maybe that's enough. What does it mean to die a good death? The phrase, "a good death," feels like a contradiction. How can death, the ultimate end, often feared and resisted, be anything but bad? Yet, throughout history and across cultures, humanity has sought ways to make death meaningful, dignified, or even beautiful. The idea of a good death raises profound questions. What does it mean to die well? Who decides what makes a death good? And, in a world where death is often out of our control, can anyone truly choose the way they die? To begin answering these questions, we must confront what most people fear about dying. For many, it's not just the pain or the act itself. It's the loss of agency, the feeling of helplessness as death arrives. A good death, then, often involves retaining some form of control, even in the face of inevitability. It's about choosing how, where, and perhaps why we die, instead of simply succumbing to fate. Historically, the concept of a good death has been tied to cultural and religious beliefs. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Socrates famously accepted his death with calm and dignity, drinking hemlock as his friends wept around him. For Socrates, death was not to be feared but embraced as a natural part of existence. Similarly, samurai warriors in feudal Japan viewed death on the battlefield as the ultimate honor. A life sacrificed in service to one's lord or ideals was considered the pinnacle of a noble life. In many religious traditions, dying well is less about the manner of death and more about the state of the soul. For Christians, the idea of a good death traditionally involved being at peace with God, confessing sins, and receiving last rites. In Buddhism, a good death means achieving a state of detachment and mindfulness, ready to transition into the next life, or even reach enlightenment. These examples highlight a key theme. A good death often depends not just on the physical circumstances, but on the meaning and preparation surrounding it. But what about the modern world? Advances in medicine have fundamentally changed how we approach death. With life support systems, advanced surgeries, and palliative care, death can be delayed for weeks, months, or even years. While this technology saves countless lives, it also creates ethical dilemmas. Is prolonging life at all costs always the right choice? For some, a dying in a hospital surrounded by machines feels cold and impersonal, a far cry from what they might consider a good death. This is where movements like hospice and palliative care come in. These practices focus not on curing illness, but on providing comfort and dignity in a person's final days. Hospice workers prioritize pain management, emotional support, and helping individuals come to terms with their mortality. The goal is simple yet profound: to allow people to die on their own terms, surrounded by loved ones, in a space that feels safe and familiar. But what about those who wish to take control of death even further? The right to die movement has sparked fierce debates worldwide, with some advocating for assisted dying as an expression of autonomy. For terminally ill patients in unbearable pain, the ability to choose when and how they die can be a profound act of agency. Countries like Switzerland, Canada, and parts of the United States have legalized forms of euthanasia or assisted suicide, offering individuals the chance to orchestrate their own passing. For them, a good death might mean slipping away peacefully, rather than enduring prolonged suffering. Yet, the idea of a good death is deeply subjective. For some, it's about being surrounded by family and friends, hearing the laughter of loved ones as they drift away. For others, it's solitude, dying quietly, with no one to witness their final moments. Some people want to die at home, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds, while others find comfort in the care of a hospital or hospice. There are those who view a good death as one that happens quickly and unexpectedly, without the fear and anticipation of a drawn-out illness. Culturally, our perceptions of a good death are shaped by how we view life itself. In individualistic societies, a good death often emphasizes personal choice and self-determination. In more collectivist cultures, the focus may be on fulfilling one's role within the family or community, even in death. For example, in some indigenous traditions, elders view death as a return to the earth and embrace it as a natural part of the cycle of life. But there's another perspective to consider. What if a good death is less about the moment of dying and more about the life that precedes it? In this view, a good death is the culmination of a life well lived, a life full of purpose, love, and connection. It's about leaving behind no regrets, no unfinished business. This aligns with the philosophy of the Stoics, who believed in preparing for death every day by living virtuously and embracing mortality. However, the reality is that not everyone gets to choose how they die. Tragic accidents, sudden illnesses, and unforeseen events remind us of how fragile and unpredictable life is. For those who die unexpectedly, the idea of a good death may seem irrelevant. But even here, there's a lesson. Perhaps a good death isn't something we achieve, but something we leave behind in the memories of those who knew us, in the kindness we shared, and in the impact we made on the world. In the end, the question of what makes a death good is as complex as life itself. It's not about finding a single answer, but exploring what matters most to each of us. A good death may be elusive, but the pursuit of it invites us to confront our fears, clarify our values, and ultimately live more fully. After all, the way we approach death says as much about how we live as it does about how we die. How does society exploit our fear of death? Fear of death is a primal instinct embedded in the human psyche for survival. Yet, in the modern world, this fear has evolved into a powerful tool, one that society exploits in ways both obvious and subtle. From religion to politics, from consumerism to media, the fear of death is leveraged to influence our behavior, control our choices, and drive industries worth billions. But how exactly is this fear weaponized? And what does it reveal about the human condition? Religion is one of the earliest and most enduring examples of how fear of death is harnessed for power and control. Across cultures and eras, religions have offered answers to the question of what happens after we die. For some, it's eternal bliss in heaven or torment in hell. For others, it's reincarnation or transcendence. These narratives promise comfort and purpose, but they also come with conditions. Believers are often required to follow specific moral codes, contribute resources, or adhere to rituals in exchange for a favorable outcome in the afterlife. While these practices may foster community and ethical living, they can also be used to manipulate. Fear of divine punishment or eternal damnation has been wielded as a tool of compliance, ensuring that individuals conform to religious authority. But religion is not the only sphere where death is used as leverage. In politics, the fear of mortality is a potent weapon. Leaders and governments have long exploited this fear to consolidate power, justify wars, and control populations. During times of crisis, such as wars, pandemics, or terrorist attacks, political rhetoric often invokes the specter of death to rally support or suppress dissent. Citizens are told they must sacrifice freedoms, accept authoritarian measures, or rally behind military action to ensure their safety. the fear of death becomes a rallying cry, silencing critical thought and encouraging unity under the banner of survival. Even in peacetime, political campaigns frequently rely on fear-based messaging. Politicians warn of threats to national security, public health, or economic stability, framing themselves as protectors against these dangers. By appealing to the fear of death, whether through crime, disease, or foreign adversaries, they gain votes, loyalty, and unquestioning obedience. Consumerism, too, thrives on our mortality anxiety. The fear of aging and death drives massive industries dedicated to prolonging life or preserving youth. Anti-aging creams, supplements, fitness programs, and medical procedures are marketed with promises of staving off the inevitable. Advertisements prey on our insecurities, framing aging as a failure and positioning their products as the solution. The beauty industry, in particular, capitalizes on the societal obsession with youth, equating it with vitality, relevance, and desirability. Healthcare is another domain where fear of death is monetized. While modern medicine has saved countless lives, it has also created a system where people are willing to pay exorbitant amounts for treatments that promise more time. End-of-life care, life-prolonging technologies, and experimental drugs often come with astronomical costs, feeding into a for-profit model that exploits our desperation to avoid death. The insurance industry is yet another example. Life insurance, health insurance, and even funeral insurance are all built on the premise of preparing for the inevitable. While these products can provide genuine security and peace of mind, they are also sold through fear-based tactics, emphasizing worst-case scenarios to convince people to buy policies. Media and entertainment also play a significant role in amplifying our fear of death. News outlets often sensationalize stories of violence, pandemics, and natural disasters, creating a narrative of constant danger. This, if it bleeds. Mentality keeps audiences hooked, glued to their screens in search of information that might help them avoid danger. In doing so, media outlets profit from heightened anxiety, using fear as a tool to drive ratings and advertising revenue. Even entertainment, in its escapism, can exploit our mortality fears. Horror movies and apocalyptic fiction tap into our primal anxieties, creating thrilling narratives that simultaneously terrify and comfort us. By confronting death in a controlled environment, we gain a sense of mastery over it, even as the entertainment industry profits from our willingness to pay for the experience. But perhaps the most insidious exploitation of death is the way it shapes societal values. We are constantly reminded that life is short, pushing us to achieve, accumulate, and consume. This fear fuels the hustle culture, where success is measured by productivity and material wealth. The pressure to leave a legacy or make an impact often leads to burnout, as people scramble to create meaning in the face of impermanence. Yet, despite this pervasive exploitation, there's a silver lining. Our fear of death also drives us to connect, create, and innovate. It pushes us to cherish relationships, pursue passions, and seek transcendence through art, science, and philosophy. While society may exploit this fear for profit or control, it also reflects humanity's relentless quest for meaning. So, what can we do about it? Awareness is the first step. By recognizing how fear of death is used to influence us, we can begin to reclaim our agency. We can question the narratives we're fed, resist fear-based manipulation, and seek meaning on our own terms. Death may be inevitable, but how we respond to it and how we allow it to shape our lives is a choice. In the end, society's exploitation of our fear of death reveals both the worst and best of humanity. It shows how deeply vulnerable we are to manipulation, but also how profoundly we care about existence. Our mortality is not just a weakness to be exploited. It's a reminder of our shared humanity and perhaps our greatest source of strength. Why do we kill? Killing is humanity's darkest act. From the battlefield to the back alley, from premeditated murders to impulsive acts of rage, the act of taking a life has haunted human history. Yet, it is as old as our species, woven into the fabric of survival, power, and morality. Why do we kill? What drives us to commit such an irreversible act? And what does it reveal about the human condition? At its most basic level, killing is rooted in biology. Like every other living creature, humans are driven by instincts to survive, compete for resources, and protect their offspring. In early human history, killing was often a matter of necessity. To protect one's family, secure food, or fend off a rival tribe, violence was an unavoidable part of life. In this context, killing wasn't seen as evil, it was survival. But as society evolved, so did the reasons behind killing, transforming it from an act of survival into something far more complex and, at times, horrifying. One of the primary drivers of killing in the modern world is power. Throughout history, wars have been fought over territory, resources, ideology, and dominance. Leaders have sent armies to their deaths, justifying the bloodshed as necessary for the greater good or national security. The pursuit of power often blinds people to the humanity of their opponents, reducing them to enemies, obstacles, or even symbols. In these cases, killing becomes a means to an end, a way to enforce authority or secure control. Religion and ideology have also played significant roles in justifying killing. Crusades, jihads, witch hunts, and genocides have all been carried out in the name of faith or belief systems. To kill for a cause is to frame violence as righteous, as though eliminating those who are different or deemed evil is not only acceptable but virtuous. This moral justification is one of the most dangerous aspects of human nature, the ability to convince oneself that killing is not only necessary but right. But killing isn't always the result of grand ideologies or quests for power. Sometimes, it is deeply personal. Jealousy, rage, betrayal, and fear can drive people to commit acts of violence they never imagined themselves capable of. In these moments, killing isn't calculated or strategic. It's impulsive, driven by raw emotion. These acts remind us of how thin the line is between civility and chaos, between reason and instinct. Then there's the chilling phenomenon of killing for pleasure. Serial killers, sadists, and those who enjoy violence challenge our understanding of morality and humanity. How can someone find joy or fulfillment in taking a life? Psychologists suggest that such individuals often lack empathy or have experienced trauma that distorts their ability to connect with others. For them, killing becomes a way to exert control, fill a void, or satisfy a twisted desire. And yet, there's another side to this question. Why do humans sometimes kill even when they don't want to? Soldiers in war often grapple with the moral weight of their actions, forced to kill under orders or in the name of survival. Many suffer from PTSD as a result, haunted by the lives they've taken. These experiences highlight a profound truth. Even in situations where killing is deemed necessary, it leaves deep scars. not just on the victims but on the perpetrators as well. Killing is not just an act, it's a psychological burden. Studies on combat veterans, police officers, and even executioners reveal that the act of taking a life often leaves an indelible mark. Guilt, nightmares, and a sense of moral injury are common. This suggests that, for most people, killing goes against our nature as social beings. We are wired to cooperate, to form communities, and to empathize with one another. The act of killing, then, is a disruption, a breaking of that social bond. But what about self-defense? Killing to protect oneself or others is often seen as justified, even necessary. In these cases, the act is framed not as an offense, but as a defense, a way to preserve life by ending a threat. Yet, even in self-defense, the moral weight of taking a life lingers. It raises questions about the value of one life over another, and whether the ends truly justify the means. In the larger scheme, killing also raises philosophical and existential questions. Is there ever a truly justifiable reason to take a life? How do we reconcile the fact that humans are capable of immense compassion, yet also capable of unimaginable violence? These contradictions lie at the heart of the human experience. Some argue that killing is a byproduct of our fear of death. By eliminating threats, we believe we are delaying our own mortality. This primal fear, buried deep in our psyche, might explain why killing often stems from desperation or self-preservation. But others see killing as a failure, not of instinct, but of morality, reason, and empathy. To kill is to sever the connection between ourselves and another being, to deny their humanity in favor of our own survival or desires. Ultimately, the question of why we kill is as complex as humanity itself. It touches on biology, psychology, culture, and morality. Killing reflects both the best and worst of us, the instinct to protect and the drive to destroy, the capacity for love and the capacity for hate. So, why do we kill? Perhaps the answer lies not in the act itself, but in what it reveals about who we are. In killing, we confront our deepest fears, our darkest impulses, and the fragile boundaries that separate us from chaos. And in that confrontation, we are forced to ask, what does it mean to be human? Can we ever defeat death? Death is humanity's oldest adversary. For centuries, we've imagined ways to defeat it through gods, technology, or sheer willpower. Myths of immortality and eternal youth have persisted across cultures, from the fountain of youth to elixirs of life. Today, these ancient fantasies are being reimagined by scientists and technologists who believe defeating death is not just possible but inevitable. But can we ever truly conquer death? And if we did, what would it mean for humanity? At its core, the desire to defeat death stems from our primal fear of the unknown. Death is the ultimate mystery, and our inability to comprehend it leaves us clinging to life at all costs. This fear has driven some of humanity's greatest achievements. Medicine, sanitation, and nutrition have all been developed to extend life and stave off death. But these advancements only buy us time. Despite all our progress, the end still comes, whether through disease, accident, or aging. Aging itself is now seen by some as a solvable problem. Scientists studying longevity have identified the biological processes that lead to aging, cellular damage, loss of genetic integrity, and the breakdown of bodily systems. Figures like Aubrey de Grey, a leading biogerontologist, argue that aging is a disease, one that can be treated, perhaps even cured. Innovations like senolytics drugs that remove aging cells and genetic editing through CRISPR are being explored as potential tools to halt or reverse aging. Could science really make death optional? Transhumanists believe it can, but not through biology alone. Their vision of immortality involves merging with technology. From uploading consciousness into digital platforms to replacing failing organs with synthetic ones. Transhumanism imagines a future where our physical limitations are overcome by human ingenuity. Imagine a world where your brain can be scanned, mapped, and uploaded into a computer. Your physical body may wither, but your mind, your thoughts, memories, and personality could live on in virtual or robotic form. But here's the unsettling question. Would that truly be you? Philosophers have long debated the nature of identity. If your consciousness is replicated, does that copy retain your essence? Or is it merely a simulation? Are we more than the sum of our memories and neural patterns? Even if technology allows us to cheat death, it might not preserve the very thing that makes us human. And then there's the moral dilemma of immortality. If we defeat death, who gets to live forever? Right now, access to advanced medical treatments is often dictated by wealth. Would immortality become a privilege reserved for the elite, creating an even greater divide between the haves and have-nots? And what happens to the world if no one dies? Overpopulation would strain resources, ecosystems, and societal structures. The planet already struggles to support its current population. How would it handle billions of people who no longer age or die? There's also the psychological burden of eternal life. Life's meaning is often tied to its finitude. A knowing that our time is limited gives urgency to our choices, significance to our relationships, and depth to our experiences. If life were endless, would it lose its intensity? Would we grow bored, apathetic, or disconnected from the things that once gave us joy? Immortality might sound appealing, but it could come at the cost of what makes life feel worth living. However, some argue that immortality could lead to unimaginable progress. Freed from the constraints of time, humanity could explore the farthest reaches of space, master new forms of art and science, and build civilizations that last for millennia. The wisdom accumulated over centuries could lead to a more enlightened and harmonious existence. Perhaps the defeat of death wouldn't rob life of meaning, but allow us to redefine it in profound and expansive ways. But what if defeating death is impossible? Some scientists and philosophers believe it's an unachievable goal, rooted in hubris rather than reality. Even if we can delay death, they argue, the universe itself is governed by entropy, the gradual decline into disorder. Eventually, everything must end, from individual lives to stars to the universe itself. If death is a fundamental law of existence, then our efforts to conquer it may be as futile as trying to stop time. Still, the pursuit of immortality raises profound philosophical and existential questions. If we did conquer death, what would we lose in the process? Would we abandon the rituals, beliefs, and stories that have shaped our understanding of life and its fragility? Would we become gods, untethered from the limitations that define us, or would we lose our humanity altogether? Ultimately, the question of whether we can defeat death is as much about who we are as it is about what we can achieve. Death defines life. It is the boundary that shapes our choices, the shadow that makes the light brighter. To defeat death would be to rewrite the very rules of existence, to challenge not just biology, but the meaning of life itself. perhaps the most important question isn't whether we can defeat death, but whether we should. Death is terrifying, but it also reminds us to cherish the fleeting beauty of existence. In the words of poet Dylan Thomas, we are urged to rage against the dying of the light. But perhaps, in doing so, we should remember that the light shines brightest because it is not eternal. Is death the ultimate freedom? Death has long been regarded as humanity's greatest adversary, something to fear, fight, and delay for as long as possible. But what if death isn't just an end, a tragedy, or an escape? What if it's the ultimate form of freedom, a liberation from the constraints, struggles, and limitations of life? This provocative idea has been explored by philosophers, poets, and mystics throughout history, and it raises unsettling yet fascinating questions about what it means to truly be free. To understand how death could represent freedom, we first need to examine what life entails. Life, for all its beauty and wonder, is inherently restrictive. We are bound by our bodies, by time, by societal expectations, and by our constant need to survive. From the moment we're born, our existence is defined by limitations: what we can do, how long we can do it, and the consequences of our actions. Take, for instance, the constraints of time. Life is finite, and every passing second brings us closer to its end. This ticking clock drives much of what we do, from pursuing careers to forming relationships to seeking purpose. While this urgency can inspire us, it also traps us in a cycle of striving, where we're always chasing something: a better job, more money, greater happiness, because we know our time is running out. In this sense, life is a paradox. It's precious because it's fleeting, but its fleeting nature creates anxiety and dissatisfaction. Death, by contrast, offers a release from this constant striving. In death, there are no deadlines, no ambitions left unfulfilled, no struggles to overcome. It is the cessation of effort, the ultimate letting go. This idea has been embraced by many spiritual traditions, which view death not as an ending, but as a return, a reunion with the universe, a state of peace where the burdens of individuality and ego dissolve. In this sense, death could be seen as the moment when we are finally free from the weight of existence itself. But is this really freedom, or just an illusion? To some, the idea of freedom in death is profoundly unsettling. After all, freedom implies choice, agency, and the ability to act. In death, we lose all of these. We can no longer make decisions, pursue dreams, or connect with others. For many, this loss of autonomy is the opposite of freedom, its annihilation. Yet, others argue that freedom doesn't always require action. Think of the concept of nirvana in Buddhism, where liberation is achieved by extinguishing desire, attachment, and the self. In this view, true freedom comes not from doing but from being, from transcending the endless cycle of craving and suffering that defines life. Death, then, might be the ultimate form of nirvana, where the struggles of existence are left behind, and we return to a state of pure, unburdened being. But there's another way to look at death as freedom, the freedom it grants to those left behind. When someone dies, their absence can profoundly affect the living, often in ways that spark transformation. A parent's death may free their child from a long-standing conflict. The loss of a partner might push someone to rediscover themselves. Even on a societal level, the death of oppressive leaders has often marked the beginning of revolutions and the birth of new freedoms. Still, the freedom that death brings is not always welcomed. For many, life's limitations are what give it meaning. The struggle to overcome obstacles, the drive to create, the desire to leave a legacy, all these pursuits are rooted in the fact that life is finite. If death offers an escape from these struggles, does it also strip life of its significance? If freedom means having nothing left to strive for, is it something we truly want? Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus grappled with these questions in their existentialist writings. For Sartre, freedom was not about escaping life, but embracing its absurdity. To live authentically, he argued, we must confront the meaningless nature of existence and create our own purpose despite it. Camus took a similar approach, famously writing that the only true philosophical question is whether or not to commit suicide. For him, the answer was to embrace life's absurdity and rebel against it, not by ending it, but by finding joy and meaning in the face of its limitations. These existentialist ideas challenge the notion that death is the ultimate freedom. Instead, they suggest that freedom is found within life, in the choices we make, and the meaning we create. To view death as freedom, they argue, is to miss the point. Freedom isn't about escaping life, but embracing it fully, limitations and all. And yet, the allure of death as freedom persists. For those who suffer, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, death can represent a release from unbearable pain. In such cases, the idea of death as liberation is deeply personal and often controversial, raising ethical questions about euthanasia and the right to die. Should we have the freedom to choose death when life becomes too much to bear? And if so, does that choice make death an act of empowerment rather than defeat? Ultimately, whether death is the ultimate freedom depends on how we define freedom itself. If freedom is about action, choice, and creation, then death may seem like the end of all possibility. But if freedom is about release, peace, and transcendence, then death might be the ultimate liberation, a return to a state of oneness, where the burdens of individuality dissolve. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Death is both an end and a beginning, a loss and a release, a tragedy and a transformation. It is not freedom in the conventional sense, but it is a reminder of the fleeting, precious nature of life. And in that reminder, it challenges us to ask, what does it mean to be free while we're still alive? What makes a life worth living if death awaits? If death is inevitable, what makes life worth living? It's a question as old as humanity itself, and it cuts to the core of our existence. Every action we take, every relationship we build, and every dream we pursue unfolds against the backdrop of mortality. So, why do we strive, love, and create when we know it will all end? What drives us to find meaning in a life destined to end in death? For many, the awareness of death is what gives life its value. Imagine a world where time stretched infinitely, where every moment could be repeated endlessly, and where there were no deadlines. In such a world, urgency and purpose might vanish. Why write a book today if you can write it in 1,000 years? Why treasure a fleeting moment if you know you'll have infinite others? Mortality, with its finite nature, forces us to cherish the present. It's the scarcity of time that makes life precious, transforming even mundane experiences into something meaningful. Relationships are one of the most profound sources of meaning in life, and they are deeply intertwined with our awareness of death. The fact that our time with loved ones is limited compels us to treasure it. Knowing that a goodbye could be final makes each moment spent together more significant. It's this fragility that deepens our connections and drives us to form bonds that transcend time. In this way, death isn't just a shadow over our lives. It's also a light that illuminates what matters most. But not everyone sees death as a motivator. For some, the inevitability of death casts a dark pall over life, making it feel pointless. Why bother striving for success if everything will eventually fade into obscurity? Why fall in love if it's destined to end in loss? These existential doubts are real and universal. But they also highlight an important truth. Meaning is not something we find. It's something we create. A philosopher, Albert Camus, captured this idea in his concept of the absurd. For Camus, life is inherently meaningless because the universe is indifferent to our existence. However, this absence of inherent meaning is not a cause for despair, it's an opportunity. If the universe doesn't impose meaning on us, then we are free to create it ourselves. Like Sisyphus, endlessly rolling a boulder up a hill, we can choose to find joy and purpose even in the face of life's futility. Art, creativity, and expression are powerful ways to create meaning in a transient world. The act of creating something, a painting, a song, a story, is a defiance of mortality. It's a way of saying, I was here. Art captures the fleeting beauty of existence, freezing moments in time and preserving them for others to experience. Even though the artist may one day be forgotten, their creation endures, a testament to the human desire to leave a mark. Yet, meaning doesn't have to be grand or permanent. It can be found in small, everyday acts of kindness, in the pleasure of a warm meal, or in the quiet joy of watching a sunrise. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche argued that meaning doesn't have to come from lofty ideals or cosmic truths. It can arise from the simple act of affirming life as it is. By embracing the ordinary, we can find extraordinary beauty in the here and now. Religion and spirituality offer another path to meaning. For many, the belief in an afterlife provides comfort and purpose, framing death not as an end, but as a transition. Faith gives people a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves, a connection to the divine or the eternal. Whether it's the promise of heaven, reincarnation, or spiritual transcendence, these beliefs help people find meaning in the face of mortality. But even for those who don't subscribe to religious or spiritual beliefs, death can be a powerful reminder of life's value. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast canyon, overwhelmed by its beauty and enormity. You know the moment is temporary, but that impermanence makes it even more profound. Life, like that moment, is fleeting. Its worth isn't diminished by its brevity, it's amplified by it. Another perspective comes from the idea of legacy. While our lives are finite, our actions can ripple outward, impacting others in ways we may never see. A kind word, a revolutionary idea, or a selfless act can leave a lasting impression. In this way, life's meaning extends beyond the individual, connecting us to the larger story of humanity. Ultimately, what makes life worth living is deeply personal. For some, it's the pursuit of knowledge, the thrill of adventure, or the satisfaction of achieving a goal. For others, it's the love of family, the camaraderie of friends, or the pursuit of justice and truth. There is no single answer, no universal formula for meaning. Each of us must discover what makes our own lives worth living, even in the shadow of death. So, What makes life worth living if death awaits? Perhaps it's the very fact that life is fleeting, unpredictable, and finite. Perhaps it's the connections we form, the moments we cherish, and the meaning we create. In the face of death, life becomes a canvas, and we are the artists, painting a story that is uniquely ours. And while the canvas may one day fade, the act of creating it is what makes it worth it. Is death truly the great equalizer? Death is often called the great equalizer. No matter how wealthy, powerful, or famous we become, death comes for us all. It doesn't discriminate based on status, race, or creed. In the end, the king and the pauper lie side by side in the soil, equal in their mortality, or so the saying goes. But is death truly the great equalizer, or is this just a comforting myth we tell ourselves to make sense of life's injustices? On the surface, the claim seems true. No one escapes death. Alexander the Great, who once conquered vast empires, succumbed to mortality, just as a nameless peasant might. Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled with absolute power, reportedly faced her final moments pleading, "All my possessions for a moment more of time." Even the wealthiest individuals, with access to the best healthcare and cutting-edge technology, cannot buy immortality. Death levels the playing field in ways life never does. But while death itself may be universal, the way we experience it, and the circumstances leading up to it, are anything but equal. Consider the stark disparities in access to healthcare. In developed nations, people live decades longer than in regions where medical resources are scarce. Even within the same country, socioeconomic status determines who receives life-saving treatments and who doesn't. The wealthy can afford experimental drugs, private hospitals, and long-term care, while the poor often face preventable deaths from treatable conditions. War provides another stark example. While politicians and leaders may order wars, it is often the poor and marginalized who fight and die in them. Soldiers, civilians, and refugees bear the brunt of conflict, while those in power often remain insulated from its deadly consequences. The same applies to systemic injustices, where certain groups, due to race, gender, or class, face higher rates of violence, premature death, and preventable disease. If death is the great equalizer, it is preceded by a profoundly unequal life. Even the rituals surrounding death highlight these disparities. A wealthy individual might be honored with a grand funeral, attended by hundreds and memorialized with elaborate tombs or mausoleums. Meanwhile, countless others are buried in unmarked graves or cremated without ceremony, their passing unnoticed by the world. These differences in how we remember the dead reflect the inequities of life, carrying them into death itself. Philosophers and thinkers have long grappled with this contradiction. Is it enough that death comes for everyone, even if its approach is unfair? For some, the universality of death offers a sense of cosmic justice. No matter how privileged or powerful someone is in life, death strips them of their status, reducing them to the same fate as everyone else. The poet John Donne wrote, "Death comes equally to us all, and makes us all equal when it comes." In this view, death serves as a humbling force, reminding us of our shared humanity. Yet, others argue that this perspective oversimplifies the issue. To say that death equalizes everyone ignores the complexities of how death is experienced and remembered. If someone lives a life of suffering, only to die young or in pain, can we truly say they are equal to someone who lived a long, comfortable, and celebrated life. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche rejected the idea of death as an equalizer, instead viewing it as part of the broader inequalities that define human existence. The idea of death as a great equalizer is also challenged by advancements in technology and science. The rise of transhumanism and longevity research has opened the possibility of extending life far beyond natural limits. Wealthy individuals are already investing in cryonics, anti-aging therapies, and genetic editing, hoping to delay or even escape death. If these technologies succeed, the gap between the haves and have-nots could grow even wider, with immortality becoming a luxury available only to the elite. In such a world, death would no longer be universal, and the idea of equality in mortality would collapse entirely. But there's another way to look at death's role as an equalizer: its ability to force us to confront what truly matters. When faced with mortality, the superficial distinctions of wealth and power often fade. A terminal diagnosis, for example, has a way of leveling priorities, reminding people of what they value most: love, connection, and purpose. In this sense, death equalizes not through the act itself, but by stripping away life's illusions, exposing our shared vulnerability. Art and literature often explore this theme, portraying death as the ultimate mirror, reflecting the essence of who we are. In Leo Tolstoy's novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a wealthy bureaucrat confronts the emptiness of his life as he lies dying. Stripped of his possessions and status, he finds meaning not in his achievements, but in the simple act of connecting with another human being. Stories like this remind us that, while death may not erase life's inequalities, it has the power to reveal deeper truths about what it means to be human. So, is death truly the great equalizer? The answer is both yes and no. On a physical level, death comes for everyone, reducing us all to dust and memory. But the conditions under which we live and die are shaped by inequality, making the experience of death anything but equal. Yet, perhaps equality isn't the point. Death's true power lies in its ability to remind us of our shared fragility, forcing us to confront what it means to be alive. In the end, death may not make us equal, but it does make us human, a humbling, universal reminder that, no matter our differences, we all face the same ultimate fate. Does nature celebrate death? At first glance, death seems like the antithesis of nature. We often associate nature with life, lush forests, thriving ecosystems, the miracle of birth and growth. Death feels like an intrusion, a destructive force that cuts life short. Yet, if we look closer, we find that death is as much a part of nature as life itself. In fact, nature not only accepts death, but seems to celebrate it, weaving it into the very fabric of existence. But how, and why, does nature embrace something that feels so final and devastating to us? Death in nature is rarely an end, it is a transformation. Consider the forest floor, where fallen leaves decompose, feeding the soil with nutrients that nourish new growth. A single decaying tree can become a microcosm of life, hosting moss, fungi, insects, and even small animals. Death here is not destruction, it is renewal. Nature's cycles depend on this constant exchange, where one form of life gives way to another. Without death, the ecosystem would collapse, suffocated by its own unchecked growth. Take the example of fungi, the unsung heroes of decomposition. Mushrooms break down dead matter, recycling it into nutrients that sustain entire ecosystems. They are nature's cleaners, transforming death into the building blocks of life. This process is so integral to the planet's health that without fungi, life as we know it would cease to exist. In this way, death is not just a necessity in nature. It is a cornerstone of creation. Predation, too, plays a crucial role in the balance of ecosystems. The predator-prey relationship may seem brutal, but it ensures population control and prevents overconsumption of resources. When a lion takes down a gazelle, it may appear cruel, but that act of death sustains the lion's pride and prevents the gazelle population from outstripping the environment's capacity to support it. This balance is not about malice or morality. It is a natural system designed for harmony. Even large-scale death events, like wildfires, are essential to nature's cycles. Fires may destroy forests, but they also clear dead wood, enrich the soil with nutrients, and make way for new growth. Some plants, like certain species of pine, have evolved to rely on fire to release their seeds, ensuring their regeneration. From destruction comes rebirth, a reminder that death in nature is often a prelude to life. But nature doesn't just use death as a tool for survival. It often seems to embrace it with elegance. Consider autumn, a season defined by the dying of leaves. The vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows that mark the end of the growing season are celebrated worldwide for their beauty. In this display, nature turns death into art, a fleeting moment of brilliance before the dormancy of winter. Even the most permanent forms of death, like extinction, have played a role in shaping life on Earth. The extinction of the dinosaurs, for instance, paved the way for mammals to rise and eventually for humans to evolve. Mass extinctions are catastrophic, but they also reset the evolutionary stage, allowing new species to emerge and thrive. This long view of death reveals it not as an aberration, but as a driving force in the story of life itself. But why does nature seem to embrace death so fully, while humans resist it? Part of the answer lies in how we perceive time. Humans view death as an interruption, cutting short our finite lives. Nature, on the other hand, operates on a much larger scale. It views death not as an individual loss but as a process, a necessary step in a cycle that spans generations and millennia. Nature also lacks the emotional weight that humans attach to death. Animals, plants, and ecosystems don't mourn the way we do. They adapt, evolve, and continue. This detachment allows nature to integrate death seamlessly into its processes, whereas humans struggle to accept its finality. Yet, even as humans resist death, we can't escape our connection to nature's cycles. Our bodies, once lifeless, return to the earth, nourishing the soil and continuing the endless cycle of matter and energy. In this way, nature welcomes us back, turning our deaths into life for something else. There's a lesson here. Nature teaches us that death is not the enemy, but a partner in the dance of existence. It shows us that endings are also beginnings, that destruction is often a prerequisite for creation. This perspective doesn't erase the pain of loss, but it offers a kind of solace. To see death as part of a larger whole is to recognize its necessity and even its beauty. So, does nature celebrate death? Perhaps not in the way we understand celebration, but it certainly doesn't shy away from it. Death in nature is purposeful, creative, and, at times, breathtakingly beautiful. It is a reminder that life and death are not opposites, but inseparable parts of the same cycle. In the end, nature's relationship with death invites us to reconsider our own, challenging us to see it not as an end, but as a vital part of life's endless renewal. Why do some cultures worship death? In much of the world, death is viewed with fear and avoidance, a shadowy force to be delayed, resisted, or ignored for as long as possible. Yet, some cultures have taken a radically different approach, embracing death as something sacred, even worthy of worship. From Mexico's Día de los Muertos to the reverence of Kali in Hinduism, these traditions view death not as an adversary, but as a profound and essential part of life. Why do some cultures celebrate and honor death? And what does this tell us about humanity's relationship with mortality? To understand the worship of death, we must first recognize its universality. Death is the one certainty every human faces, regardless of status, wealth, or belief. It's the ultimate equalizer, and for many cultures, this inevitability demands not fear, but respect. By acknowledging and even venerating death, people confront their mortality in a way that feels empowering rather than terrifying. Take Mexico's Día de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, as an example. This vibrant celebration transforms mourning into an act of remembrance and joy. Families build altars adorned with marigolds, photographs, candles, and the favorite foods of deceased loved ones, inviting their spirits to return for a night of celebration. Far from being a somber affair, the holiday is marked by music, dancing, and laughter. Death, in this context, is not an end but a continuation, a chance to reconnect with those who have passed. This tradition stems from a deep cultural belief that the dead are not truly gone but exist in another realm, watching over the living. By honoring them, families maintain a connection that transcends death. Worshipping death, in this sense, becomes a way of celebrating life itself, ensuring that the bonds of love and memory remain unbroken. A similar reverence for death can be found in Hinduism, where the goddess Kali embodies both creation and destruction. Often depicted with a garland of skulls and a fierce, unyielding gaze, Kali represents the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. To her devotees, she is not a figure to fear but a source of liberation, cutting through illusion and ego to reveal deeper truths. By embracing Kali, worshippers confront the inevitability of death and find freedom in accepting it as a natural part of existence. These practices challenge the Western tendency to view death as something to be fought against at all costs. In cultures that worship death, there's often an underlying philosophy that life and death are not opposites, but inseparable parts of the same whole. This cyclical view of existence is particularly prominent in indigenous traditions. Many Native American tribes, for example, see death as a return to the earth, a reunification with the natural world. The deceased are not mourned in isolation, but celebrated as part of the ongoing cycle of life. But why do some cultures embrace this perspective while others shun it? One explanation lies in the role of religion and spirituality. Cultures that worship death often have spiritual systems that emphasize continuity rather than finality. In these belief systems, death is not an ending but a transition, a doorway to another state of being. By venerating death, these cultures acknowledge its power while stripping it of its sting. Another factor is the environment in which these traditions developed. In regions where death was a frequent and visible part of life, whether due to war, famine, or high mortality rates, people often developed rituals and beliefs to cope with its omnipresence. Worshipping death became a way to make sense of the chaos, to find beauty and order in what might otherwise feel meaningless. In addition to spirituality and environment, there's a psychological aspect to death worship. By confronting death directly, these traditions offer a way to manage the existential dread that comes with mortality. Instead of avoiding the topic, they invite people to engage with it, transforming fear into acceptance. This approach can be profoundly healing, offering a sense of peace and perspective that denial cannot provide. At the same time, the worship of death is not without its complexities. For some, it can blur the line between reverence and romanticization, leading to practices that may appear morbid or unsettling to outsiders. The Mexican folk saint Santa Muerte, for example, has gained a following among those seeking her protection, often in marginalized communities. Critics argue that her veneration sometimes glorifies the darker aspects of mortality, including violence and criminality. Yet, for her devotees, Santa Muerte is a figure of compassion and justice, a protector who doesn't judge or discriminate. Ultimately, cultures that worship death remind us that our relationship with mortality is not fixed. It is shaped by history, environment, and belief, and it can evolve over time. These traditions challenge the dominant narrative that death is solely an enemy to be feared. Instead, they invite us to see death as a teacher, a reminder of life's impermanence and its beauty. In the end, the worship of death is less about death itself and more about how we choose to live. By acknowledging the inevitability of our own mortality, we can approach life with greater clarity and purpose. Far from being morbid, these practices reflect a deep wisdom. That to understand death is to understand life, and to embrace one is to embrace the other. Does death solve the problem of evil? Evil is one of humanity's oldest philosophical dilemmas. Why does it exist? Why do people suffer? And why does cruelty often go unpunished? For centuries, thinkers and theologians have grappled with these questions, offering explanations ranging from free will to divine mystery. But what if the answer lies not in life, but in death? Could death, in its finality, be the ultimate resolution to the problem of evil? To explore this, we first need to define what we mean by evil. Philosophers often divide it into two categories: moral evil, such as human actions like murder and betrayal, and natural evil, such as diseases, disasters, and other forces beyond human control. Both forms of evil challenge our sense of justice and meaning, especially when they seem arbitrary or undeserved. Enter death. At first glance, death appears to exacerbate the problem of evil. It takes the innocent and guilty alike, often with no regard for fairness. A child dies of a rare disease, while a dictator lives to old age. In these moments, death feels less like a resolution and more like another cruelty, compounding the injustices of life. How can something so indiscriminate offer any kind of solution to evil? Yet, death also has a curious way of leveling the playing field. No matter how much wealth, power, or influence a person accumulates, death comes for everyone. For those who suffer under systems of oppression, this universality can offer a grim sense of justice. A tyrant may evade earthly consequences, but they cannot escape death. This inevitability strips even the most powerful of their control, forcing them to confront the same end as those they harmed. For some, this alone makes death a kind of resolution. It acts as the ultimate equalizer, dismantling the hierarchies that enable much of the world's moral evil. In death, the billionaire and the beggar share the same fate, reduced to memories and dust. While this doesn't undo the harm caused by evil, at least ensures that no one escapes life unscathed. But there's another way to look at how death interacts with evil, as a relief from suffering. For those enduring immense pain, whether from illness, poverty, or emotional anguish, death can feel like liberation. This perspective is particularly evident in philosophies like Buddhism, where death is seen as part of the cycle of samsara, or endless suffering. To escape this cycle through enlightenment is to transcend not just life, but the pain and evil that accompany it. From this standpoint, death is not just an end but a doorway. It offers a release from the burdens of existence, including the weight of evil. For many spiritual traditions, this idea is central to their understanding of justice. Christianity, for example, posits that death leads to divine judgment, where good is rewarded and evil is punished. In this sense, death doesn't just resolve evil, it delivers justice, ensuring that wrongs are righted in a way life cannot. But what about those who don't believe in an afterlife? For atheists and agnostics, death is often viewed as the cessation of consciousness. This raises a provocative question. If death truly is the end, does it render evil irrelevant? Without an afterlife, there is no eternal punishment for the wicked, but there is also no eternal suffering for the victims of evil. In this sense, death acts as a neutralizer, silencing both the cries of pain and the echoes of cruelty. Yet, this perspective isn't entirely comforting. If death erases everything, does it also erase meaning? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned against the nihilism that arises from this view, where life's struggles and the evils we face seem devoid of purpose. If death is the only resolution to evil, is it truly a solution, or merely a void? Some argue that the very existence of death challenges the concept of evil itself. If life is finite, then even the greatest suffering has an endpoint. A dictator's atrocities may span decades, but death ensures they cannot last forever. In this sense, evil is always temporary, while death is permanent. This realization can offer a strange form of solace. No matter how much cruelty exists in the world, it is ultimately fleeting. But there's a darker side to this idea. If death solves the problem of evil, does it also make evil easier to justify? Some might argue that because death erases suffering, the harm caused by evil is less significant. This logic can be dangerous, reducing the urgency of addressing injustice in life. After all, if death is the great neutralizer, why fight against evil at all? The answer lies in how we choose to view life in the shadow of death. While death may offer a resolution to evil, it doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to confront it. Instead, it forces us to grapple with the question of what kind of world we want to leave behind. If death marks the end of individual suffering, then life becomes our opportunity to reduce suffering for others. In the end, death's relationship with evil is both profound and paradoxical. It can feel like a cruel accomplice, a silent witness to life's injustices. Yet, it also acts as a final arbiter, ending suffering and leveling the scales. Whether we see death as a resolution, a release, or an enigma, one thing is clear. Its presence shapes how we understand and respond to the problem of evil. And perhaps that, more than anything, is its ultimate role, not to solve evil, but to remind us of the urgency of addressing it while we still can. What role does art play in facing death? Art has always been humanity's companion in grappling with the unanswerable questions of life and death. From ancient cave paintings to modern digital installations, art captures the fears, hopes, and mysteries that surround mortality. It offers a mirror to our deepest anxieties and a canvas for our wildest imaginings. But what exactly is art's role in facing death? Does it help us accept the inevitable, rebel against it, or simply make sense of its finality? At its core, art is a form of expression, a way to externalize what often feels too vast or abstract to articulate. Death, as the ultimate unknown, has always been one of its most compelling subjects. For centuries, artists have used their work to depict death in its many forms, violent and peaceful, terrifying and serene, inevitable yet mysterious. The Dance of Death, a medieval artistic motif, portrayed skeletons leading kings, peasants, and clergy alike to their graves, reminding viewers that death spares no one. In this way, art acts as a bridge between the incomprehensible and the tangible, giving shape to the shapeless. But art doesn't just reflect death, it challenges it. Through storytelling, painting, music, and sculpture, humans defy the impermanence of life by creating something that can outlast them. A poem, a song, or a masterpiece becomes a piece of immortality, a way to say, "I was here." This is particularly evident in memorial art, such as the Taj Mahal, a monument built out of love and grief, or Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which preserves the names of those who died in service. These works transform loss into legacy, ensuring that those who are gone are not forgotten. In this sense, art serves as a form of resistance. While death silences the body, art amplifies the voice, allowing it to echo through time. Consider Vincent van Gogh, whose life was marked by poverty, mental illness, and a lack of recognition. He died at 37, believing he had failed. Yet his work now resonates with millions, its vibrant colors and emotive brushstrokes a testament to the enduring power of art. Van Gogh's story highlights how art can transcend death, ensuring that a person's essence lives on long after they're gone. But art doesn't just memorialize the dead, it also helps the living confront their mortality. Music, in particular, has a unique ability to evoke emotions tied to death. Funeral dirges, requiems, and elegies guide listeners through the process of mourning, offering a structure for grief that words alone often cannot provide. Mozart's The Requiem remains one of the most haunting and beautiful pieces of music ever written, its unfinished nature a poignant reflection of his own untimely death. Similarly, contemporary songs like Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah and David Bowie's Lazarus grapple with themes of mortality, resonating with audiences who find solace in their raw honesty. Visual art also plays a critical role in processing death. Memento Mori, a Latin phrase meaning, "Remember you must die," was a common theme in Renaissance art, often featuring skulls, hourglasses, and decaying fruit as reminders of life's brevity. Far from being morbid, these works encourage reflection on how we spend our time and what we leave behind. Modern artists continue this tradition, exploring death in ways that challenge and provoke. Damien Hirst's Ooh for the Love of God, a platinum skull encrusted with diamonds, confronts viewers with the tension between mortality and materialism, forcing us to question what truly lasts after we die. Literature, too, offers a powerful lens for exploring death. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, to contemporary novels like Eijiro Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, writers have used fiction to wrestle with the inevitability of loss. Poetry, in particular, has a unique ability to distill the enormity of death into a few lines. Emily Dickinson's "Because I Could Not Stop for Death" imagines death as a carriage driver gently guiding the poet toward eternity. Through metaphors and imagery, literature helps us approach death from new angles, breaking down its enormity into something we can engage with and understand. Art also provides a space for catharsis, allowing people to process their grief in a way that feels personal and meaningful. Creating art, whether painting, writing, or dancing, can be a therapeutic outlet for those coping with loss. The act of creation becomes a way to channel pain into something tangible, transforming sorrow into beauty. In this way, art doesn't just confront death, it helps us heal from it. Yet, art's relationship with death isn't always solemn. It can also be playful, even celebratory. Mexican artist Josu Guadalupe Posada's Y La Catrina depicts a skeleton dressed in lavish clothing, a figure now synonymous with Dia de los Muertos. This playful representation of death reminds us that while mortality is inevitable, it doesn't have to be feared. Art like this invites us to embrace death as part of life, finding joy and humor in its universality. In the end, art's role in facing death is as varied and complex as death itself. It can be a mirror, reflecting our fears and questions, a shield, preserving our essence against the erasure of time, or a bridge, connecting us to those we've lost and to the larger mysteries of existence. Above all, art reminds us that while death is universal, so too is our capacity to find meaning, beauty, and connection in its shadow. And perhaps that is art's greatest gift, to make the unknowable a little more bearable, and in doing so, to help us live more fully. Why do some welcome death? For most, the thought of death is accompanied by fear, sadness, or a desperate desire to delay it. Yet, there are those who approach death not with dread, but with open arms, viewing it as a release, a reunion, or even a triumph. Why do some people welcome death when the instinct to survive is so deeply embedded in human nature? What drives this willingness to embrace the inevitable? One of the most profound reasons people welcome death is the perception of it as a release from suffering. For those enduring chronic pain, terminal illness, or the deep emotional wounds of trauma, life can become an unbearable burden. In such cases, death is not seen as the enemy, but as a form of mercy, a chance to escape from unrelenting physical or psychological torment. This perspective is reflected in practices like euthanasia or assisted dying, where individuals with terminal conditions choose to take control of their deaths. To them, the choice is not about giving up, but reclaiming dignity and agency in the face of the inevitable. But it's not only suffering that leads some to welcome death. It's also the belief in what lies beyond. Many religions and spiritual traditions frame death as a transition rather than an end. For Christians, death may mean entering the gates of heaven, reuniting with loved ones, and basking in eternal peace. For Hindus and Buddhists, it is part of the cycle of samsara, where the soul moves closer to enlightenment with each rebirth. Those who hold these beliefs often see death not as a loss, but as a step forward, a chance to transcend earthly struggles and embrace a higher state of existence. Mystics and sages throughout history have gone even further, regarding death as a reunion with the infinite. The Sufi poet Rumi described death as a wedding, a joyful union with the divine. This perspective reimagines mortality as a return to our true essence, where the boundaries of individuality dissolve into something far greater. For those who view death this way, life's struggles are temporary, and death is the long-awaited homecoming. There is also a psychological dimension to welcoming death, particularly among those who feel they've lived a complete life. For individuals who have achieved their goals, found fulfillment, and said their goodbyes, death can feel like the natural conclusion to a well-lived story. These individuals often exhibit what psychologists call death acceptance, a state of mind where the fear of dying is replaced by a sense of peace and readiness. They view life as a book with a final chapter and see no tragedy in reaching the end. In some cases, the willingness to embrace death stems from a sense of duty or sacrifice. Soldiers, first responders, and activists often put themselves in harm's way, knowing the risks, but believing in a cause greater than themselves. For these individuals, death is not just accepted but welcomed as a testament to their values. History is replete with examples of people who willingly faced death to save others, defend their beliefs, or fight for freedom. This selflessness turns death into an act of meaning, a legacy that transcends mortality. However, not all who welcome death do so from a place of peace or purpose. For some, the desire for death arises from despair. Depression and other mental health struggles can distort one's perception of life, making it feel hopeless and unbearable. In these cases, the longing for death is not about embracing the end, but escaping the present. This distinction is crucial, as it highlights the difference between accepting death and yearning for it due to unmet needs or untreated pain. Cultural attitudes also shape how people view death. In societies where mortality is openly discussed and ritualized, death is often seen as less frightening. Take the Japanese concept of mono no aware, which emphasizes the beauty of impermanence. By accepting that all things must end, individuals may come to appreciate life's fleeting nature and view death with gratitude rather than resistance. Similarly, in indigenous traditions, death is often regarded as a return to the earth, a way of completing the cycle of life. These cultural perspectives create a framework in which welcoming death is not seen as morbid, but as natural and even honorable. Then there are those who welcome death as an act of rebellion against the fear that governs much of human existence. Existentialist philosophers like Albert Camus argued that the awareness of death gives life its urgency and meaning. By confronting and embracing death, individuals can live more authentically, free from the denial and distractions that often accompany the fear of mortality. For these thinkers, welcoming death is not about seeking it prematurely, but about stripping it of its power to control us. But what about the notion of freedom? For some, death is viewed as the ultimate liberation from the constraints of the body, the expectations of society, and the burdens of time. In death, there are no deadlines, no responsibilities, no struggles. This perspective may be difficult to understand in a world that values productivity and achievement, but for those who see life as a series of limitations, death represents the ultimate release. Ultimately, those who welcome death challenge us to rethink our relationship with mortality. They remind us that death is not a monolithic experience. It is deeply personal, shaped by beliefs, circumstances, and choices. Whether seen as a release, a transition, or a sacrifice, the act of welcoming death reflects the complexity of human existence and the myriad ways we find meaning in the face of the inevitable. And perhaps that's the most intriguing part. In welcoming death, some find a deeper appreciation for life itself, seeing it not as something to cling to, but as a fleeting gift to be embraced, cherished, and ultimately released when the time comes. Does death have a moral obligation? Death is often viewed as a natural event, an unavoidable fact of existence. But what if death serves a purpose beyond its inevitability? What if death has a moral obligation, a role to play in maintaining balance, justice, and harmony in the world? This provocative idea invites us to question whether mortality is simply a biological necessity or a force imbued with ethical weight. Does death owe something to the living? And if so, what is its duty? To explore this, we must first consider the role death plays in nature. On a biological level, death is essential for life. Ecosystems thrive because of the cycle of birth, death, and renewal. Without death, resources would deplete, populations would explode, and the delicate balance of nature would collapse. In this context, death's obligation seems clear: to maintain equilibrium. By removing the old, the weak, and the excess, death ensures that life can continue. But when we shift from ecosystems to individual lives, the moral implications of death become murkier. Does death have a responsibility to act fairly? At first glance, it appears indifferent, taking the young and old, the innocent and guilty, the kind and cruel with no discernible pattern. This randomness is part of what makes death so unsettling. It defies our sense of justice. A child's sudden passing feels profoundly unjust, while the prolonged life of a tyrant feels like a failure of morality. If death has a moral obligation, why does it seem so arbitrary? One way to reconcile this is to consider the idea that death's morality lies not in individual cases, but in its universality. Everyone, regardless of status, wealth, or power, must face it. This universality acts as a great equalizer, a humbling force that reminds us of our shared humanity. In this sense, death's moral obligation could be seen as impartiality. It spares no one, leveling the playing field in a way life often does not. Yet, this perspective doesn't fully address the complexities of human suffering. For those living in extreme pain, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, death can feel like a release, a merciful act that ends their torment. In such cases, death seems to fulfill a different kind of obligation: to offer relief. This idea underpins debates about euthanasia and assisted dying, where the question is not whether death should occur, but whether it has a moral duty to intervene when life becomes unbearable. In contrast, there are times when death is viewed as arriving too soon, robbing individuals of potential, relationships, and accomplishments. When a promising young life is cut short, we often lament the unfairness of it, as though death has violated some ethical code. These moments raise profound questions about the morality of mortality. Should death consider the value of a life, the impact of its timing, or the ripple effects it leaves behind? Religion and philosophy have long grappled with these questions. Many belief systems assign a moral framework to death, portraying it as part of a divine plan. In Christianity, for example, death is not the end, but a transition to judgment, where one's actions in life determine their eternal fate. In this context, death serves a moral purpose, acting as a gateway to justice. Similarly, Hinduism and Buddhism view death as part of a karmic cycle, where the circumstances of one's death and rebirth are shaped by their actions. Here, death's obligation is not to fairness in life, but to a larger cosmic order. But what if we step away from spiritual interpretations and view death through the lens of human responsibility? Some argue that death's moral obligation is not errant but imposed by us. In other words, it's not death itself that must act morally, it's how we respond to it. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic, where millions of deaths sparked debates about public health, resource allocation, and collective responsibility. The moral weight of death in these situations isn't on death itself, but on how societies navigate its impact. This perspective also applies to broader ethical dilemmas, such as overpopulation and environmental degradation. As medical advancements extend lifespans and reduce mortality rates, humanity faces new challenges: how to sustain growing populations without depleting resources. In this context, death's role becomes more visible. By making room for new generations, death fulfills a duty to balance the needs of the living with the limitations of the planet. There's also the idea that death teaches us moral lessons. Its inevitability forces us to confront our values, priorities, and relationships. Knowing that life is finite compels many to live more intentionally, to seek meaning and connection. In this way, death's moral obligation might be less about fairness and more about perspective. It challenges us to find purpose in the face of impermanence, to live in a way that makes the inevitability of death feel less like a loss and more like a completion. Yet, this interpretation doesn't erase the emotional weight of grief or the sense of injustice that often accompanies loss. Death, for all its philosophical and biological roles, is deeply personal. Its arrival, whether welcomed or feared, disrupts lives and leaves lasting voids. Perhaps, then, death's true moral obligation is to remind us of the fragility of life, not as a threat, but as an invitation to appreciate what we have while we have it. In the end, the question of whether death has a moral obligation is as complex as death itself. It is both impartial and deeply impactful, universal yet intimately felt. Whether we see it as a natural force, a cosmic balance, or an abstract concept, death challenges us to grapple with the ethics of existence. And perhaps that is its ultimate purpose, not to act morally itself, but to compel us to consider what morality means in the shadow of mortality. Why does death inspire horror? Death has fascinated humanity for millennia, but it also terrifies us to our core. This fear manifests in many forms, from ghost stories whispered around a campfire to grotesque depictions of corpses in horror films. Death, in all its mystery and finality, has become one of the most potent sources of horror in our collective imagination. But why does death inspire such visceral dread? Is it the fear of the unknown, the grotesque nature of decay, or something deeper, something primal and universal? At the heart of our horror is the unknowable nature of death. No one truly knows what happens when we die. Is it oblivion, a dreamless sleep where consciousness ceases? Or is it a transition to another existence, as many religions suggest? This lack of certainty creates a void, one that we fill with our darkest fears. Death becomes a canvas for the imagination, a space where we project our anxieties about eternity, punishment, or simply the loss of self. It's this uncertainty that makes death fertile ground for horror, where the mind conjures images more terrifying than reality could ever provide. But it's not just the abstract concept of death that frightens us, it's the physical reality of it. The human body, once vibrant and alive, undergoes a transformation in death that is deeply unsettling. The process of decay, the pallor of the skin, the stiffness of rigor mortis, the smell of decomposition, reminds us of our mortality in the most visceral way possible. Corpses, especially in their decayed state, are often used in horror stories and films to evoke revulsion and fear. This reaction isn't just cultural, it's biological. Scientists suggest that humans are hardwired to avoid decay because it signals danger. Rotting flesh can carry disease, and our aversion is a survival mechanism. Cultural taboos around death amplify this horror. In many societies, death is sanitized and hidden from view. We avoid discussing it openly, and the dying are often secluded in hospitals or hospice care. Funerals, embalming, and other rituals create a distance between the living and the dead. This separation makes death seem alien, something to fear rather than accept. When horror stories break these taboos, showing bodies in states of decay or spirits lingering in haunted spaces, they force us to confront what we've been conditioned to avoid. The fear of death also taps into our most primal instincts, the drive to survive. Evolution has hardwired us to fear anything that threatens our existence. This fear becomes even more potent when death is personified, as it often is in myths and literature. The Grim Reaper, with his skeletal frame and scythe, embodies the inevitability of death, making it both a character and a concept we cannot escape. This personification transforms death from an abstract idea into an active force, one that hunts, stalks, and takes. Horror also emerges from the idea of unfinished business. The thought of dying with regrets, unresolved conflicts, or unfulfilled dreams is a common human anxiety. Ghost stories often center on this theme, with spirits lingering because they cannot move on. These tales reflect our fears of leaving the world incomplete, of being unable to let go or find peace. Haunted houses, cursed objects, and vengeful spirits all stem from this unease, turning personal fears into universal horror. Religious and cultural beliefs further shape how death inspires fear. In many traditions, death is not the end, but the beginning of a judgment process. The concept of hell, purgatory, or karmic retribution can be terrifying, suggesting that what comes after death may be worse than life itself. This fear of post-mortem punishment is a recurring theme in horror. From Dance Inferno to modern depictions of demonic possession, it's not just the act of dying that frightens us, but the possibility of eternal consequences. Even the living can inspire horror when their connection to death feels unnatural. Zombies, for example, are terrifying because they blur the line between life and death. They are familiar yet grotesque, human yet inhuman. Similarly, vampires evoke fear not just because they kill, but because they defy death entirely, existing in a liminal state between life and the grave. These creatures embody our discomfort with the unnatural and our inability to fully grasp what it means to die. However, not all horror surrounding death is rooted in fear of the unknown or the grotesque. Some of it comes from empathy. Watching a loved one die or imagining their absence can be emotionally devastating. Horror taps into this vulnerability, creating scenarios where characters lose those they love or must confront their own mortality in terrifying ways. This emotional resonance makes death in horror stories feel personal, heightening its impact. But why do we seek out horror if it frightens us so deeply? Perhaps it's because horror allows us to confront death in a controlled environment. By watching a scary movie or reading a ghost story, we face our fears from a safe distance. This exposure helps us process our anxieties, giving us a sense of mastery over something we cannot escape. In this way, horror becomes a tool for understanding and even accepting death, transforming fear into catharsis. Ultimately, death inspires horror because it reflects our deepest fears: fear of the unknown, fear of decay, fear of losing ourselves and those we love. But it also reminds us of life's fragility, urging us to confront the inevitability of our end. Horror may terrify us, but it also forces us to grapple with questions we might otherwise avoid, making death not just a source of fear, but of profound reflection. Can love survive death? Love is often described as eternal, a force so profound that it transcends time, space, and even death itself. From ancient myths to modern poetry, we are captivated by the idea that love can endure beyond the grave, binding souls together in defiance of mortality. But is this belief rooted in truth? Or is it simply a comforting story we tell ourselves? Can love truly survive death? And if so, in what form does it persist? To begin answering this question, we must first consider what we mean by love. Is it the bond between two people, the memories they share, or the actions they take to express their care? If love is tied to the physical presence of a person, then death seems to sever it. The body, the vessel through which love is expressed, is no longer there. Yet, even in the absence of a loved one, the feelings they inspired remain. This suggests that love is not confined to the physical. It exists in the mind and heart of the living, carried forward through memory and emotion. One of the most compelling ways love survives death is through legacy. Parents who pass away live on through their children, not only in their genetic material, but in the values, lessons, and traditions they instilled. Partners who lose each other often keep their love alive by honoring shared dreams, preserving mementos, or continuing rituals that held meaning in their relationship. These acts of remembrance transform love into something enduring, a force that persists even when one of its participants is gone. But love's survival isn't just a matter of memory, it also shapes those left behind. Psychologists often describe how the love we receive from others becomes part of who we are, influencing how we see the world, form relationships, and define our values. When a loved one dies, their impact doesn't vanish, it continues to echo in the lives of those they touched. In this way, love transcends death by becoming part of the living, woven into the fabric of their being. Art and literature provide some of the most vivid explorations of love's persistence after death. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet portrays a love so powerful it defies even the grave, while Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights imagines love as an elemental force, unbound by mortality. In these stories, love doesn't merely survive death, it becomes more potent because of it. The loss amplifies the intensity, turning it into something eternal and unassailable. Religious and spiritual traditions offer another perspective. Many faiths teach that love is eternal, transcending the physical world and continuing in the afterlife. Christianity, for example, envisions heaven as a place where love is perfected, a reunion with God and with loved ones who have passed. Hinduism and Buddhism see love as part of the karmic cycle, influencing the soul's journey through reincarnation. These beliefs provide comfort, suggesting that death is not the end of love, but a transformation of it into a different, perhaps purer, form, but without the possibility that love survives in ways we cannot yet comprehend. Some scientists and philosophers have speculated that consciousness may not be entirely tied to the physical brain. If this is true, could love, a deeply emotional and energetic connection, exist beyond the death of the body? While there's no definitive evidence to support this idea, it continues to capture the imagination, fueling debates about the nature of existence and the mysteries of the universe. The idea that love transcends death also finds expression in paranormal stories. Ghost tales often center on spirits lingering due to love, parents watching over their children, partners refusing to leave one another, or friends protecting those they cared for in life. Whether or not one believes in ghosts, these stories highlight a universal yearning, the hope that love is strong enough to persist, even when everything else fades. Yet, there is a darker side to love's endurance. Grief, after all, is love that has lost its object. The pain of losing someone we love can feel like a wound that never fully heals, a testament to how deeply they are woven into our lives. In this way, love survives death, but it often does so in the form of longing, a haunting reminder of what was and what can never be again. This bittersweet persistence is both the beauty and the tragedy of love. Still, love's survival isn't just about the past. It also shapes the future. Many who lose loved ones channel their grief into acts of kindness, creativity, or advocacy. They start foundations, write books, or dedicate their lives to causes that honor the memory of those they've lost. In doing so, they ensure that the love they shared doesn't end with death, but becomes a force for good in the world. Ultimately, the question of whether love survives death depends on how we define survival. If we look for physical presence or tangible proof, the answer may seem bleak. But if we view love as something that exists in memory, action, and influence, its survival becomes undeniable. Love doesn't vanish when someone dies. It transforms, taking on new shapes and finding new ways to endure. So, can love survive death? Perhaps the better question is, how could it not? Love, by its nature, is expansive, creative, and resilient. It is one of the few forces that can bridge the gap between the living and the dead, turning loss into legacy, pain into purpose, and memory into meaning. In the face of mortality, love reminds us that while bodies may perish, the connections we forge remain, and in that, love is truly eternal. What if we could choose when to die? What if death weren't an uncontrollable force, but a decision we could make for ourselves? Imagine a world where each individual could determine the precise moment of their passing, free from the unpredictability of disease, accidents, or aging. This concept, while intriguing, raises profound ethical, philosophical, and societal questions. Would choosing when to die empower us, or would it burden us with impossible decisions? What would life mean if death were a choice? The idea of controlling one's death is not entirely new. For centuries, cultures have debated the morality and implications of suicide, euthanasia, and sacrifice. In ancient Japan, the samurai practiced seppuku, a ritual suicide performed to preserve honor. In modern times, assisted dying has become a contentious topic, with advocates arguing for autonomy and opponents citing moral and ethical concerns. But these cases are exceptions to the rule. Death, for most of us, is something we cannot control. What would change if we could? The first and most obvious consequence of choosing one's death would be the shift in our relationship with life itself. Much of what drives human ambition, creativity, and purpose stems from the knowledge that our time is limited. If we had the power to decide when to die, would we still feel the same urgency to achieve, connect, or experience? Or would the ability to extend life indefinitely lead to apathy, procrastination, and stagnation? On the other hand, the freedom to choose one's death could inspire a deeper appreciation for life. Knowing you have control might reduce the fear and anxiety that often accompany thoughts of mortality. Instead of dreading an unknown end, you could focus on living fully, making deliberate choices about how to spend your time and when to say goodbye. This sense of empowerment could lead to greater clarity about what truly matters, allowing people to craft lives filled with intention and meaning. But this autonomy would come with its own burdens. Deciding when to die is not a simple choice. It's one weighted with emotion, uncertainty, and potential regret. Would people feel pressured to choose an appropriate time to die, based on societal expectations or family dynamics? For example, an elderly person might feel obligated to end their life to avoid being a financial or emotional burden on their loved ones. Similarly, those facing terminal illness might struggle with guilt, torn between prolonging their lives and sparing their families the pain of watching them suffer. The ability to choose death would also have profound implications for relationships. How would families cope with knowing a loved one's chosen date of death? Would this foreknowledge provide an opportunity for closure and meaningful goodbyes, or would it create unbearable tension and sorrow as the day approached? For some, the knowledge might deepen bonds, allowing for final moments of connection. For others, it could make every interaction feel heavy, overshadowed by the impending loss. On a societal level, granting individuals the power to choose death could fundamentally alter how we view aging, healthcare, and community. If death became a choice, would people still invest in medical advancements and long-term care? Would society continue to value the wisdom and contributions of older generations? Or would it subtly encourage those who are no longer productive to step aside? These questions reveal the potential for abuse in a system where life and death are commodified, where the right to die might become an expectation rather than a freedom. Philosophically, the concept of choosing death forces us to confront what it means to live. If life is precious because it's finite, does having control over death diminish its value? Some argue that mortality gives life its meaning, that the unpredictability of death drives us to make the most of our time. If death became a matter of choice, would life lose some of its urgency, its poignancy, and its beauty? However, others see the potential for liberation in this idea. Choosing when to die could be an act of self-determination, a way to reclaim control over one's existence. For those facing unbearable suffering, the ability to choose death would offer a sense of agency in situations where they often feel powerless. Similarly, individuals who have accomplished their goals or feel at peace with their lives might view choosing death as a natural and dignified conclusion. Technological advancements could further complicate this issue. Imagine a future where AI or medical technology could predict the perfect moment for someone to die, based on their health, happiness, and life circumstances. Would people trust machines to make this decision, or would they rebel against the idea of an algorithm determining their fate? And what role would governments and institutions play in regulating the right to choose death? Ultimately, the question of whether we should be able to choose when to die is as much about ethics as it is about philosophy. It forces us to confront the delicate balance between freedom and responsibility, between individual rights and societal impacts. It challenges us to consider what makes life meaningful, and whether that meaning depends on death being out of our control. Perhaps the most profound takeaway is this: whether or not we can choose when to die, the reality of death shapes how we live. The idea of controlling our mortality invites us to think deeply about what we value, what we fear, and what it means to truly live. In the end, it may not be the ability to choose death that defines us, but the way we choose to face life in its shadow. Why do we fear being forgotten after death? As humans, we crave significance. We want to believe that our lives matter, that the relationships we forge, the work we do, and the memories we create will endure. But death presents an unsettling reality: the possibility of being forgotten. The thought of our existence fading into oblivion can be as terrifying as death itself. Why do we fear being forgotten after we die, and how does this fear shape the way we live? At its core, the fear of being forgotten is tied to our sense of identity. We spend our lives constructing a self. Our achievements, passions, and relationships are all part of a story we tell about who we are. Death disrupts that narrative, severing our ability to influence the world around us. Being forgotten feels like a second death, the erasure of everything we built and everything we believed mattered. It confronts us with the question: if no one remembers us, did our lives have meaning? This fear is deeply rooted in the human psyche. Unlike animals, humans possess the unique ability to think about the future and reflect on the past. This awareness of time allows us to contemplate our legacy, how we will be remembered, and whether we will leave a lasting impact. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that this fear might have a survival advantage. By striving to be remembered, we are more likely to contribute to our communities, ensuring that our genes, ideas, and values are passed on. In this way, the fear of being forgotten drives us to create, achieve, and connect. Yet, this fear is not just biological, it's cultural. Throughout history, humans have sought ways to preserve their memory. Ancient Egyptians built pyramids to immortalize their pharaohs. Greek and Roman poets wrote epics, hoping their words would echo through the ages. Even today, we build monuments, write memoirs, and take endless photos in the hope that our lives will leave a mark. These acts of preservation are a testament to our desire to resist the erasure that death threatens. But in the grand scheme of things, how realistic is this desire? The vast majority of people who have ever lived are forgotten. Their names, stories, and struggles have vanished into history, remembered only by the ripples of their actions, if at all. This realization can be profoundly unsettling. It forces us to confront the transient nature of life and the futility of trying to achieve permanence in a world governed by change. For some, this realization leads to despair, a sense of insignificance in the face of eternity. If everything we do is destined to be forgotten, what's the point of striving, loving, or creating? Philosophers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre grappled with this existential anxiety, ultimately arguing that meaning must come from within. According to Camus, the absurdity of life its fleeting nature and lack of inherent meaning, should not lead to despair but to rebellion. By embracing life's impermanence, we can find joy and purpose in the present moment, even if we are forgotten. Yet, for others, the fear of being forgotten becomes a motivator. It drives people to achieve greatness, to leave behind something that will endure. Artists, scientists, and leaders often speak of a desire to create a legacy, to ensure their work will outlive them. This ambition has led to some of humanity's greatest achievements, from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel to the moon landing. The fear of being forgotten, when channeled positively, can inspire remarkable acts of creativity and innovation. However, this pursuit of legacy can also be fraught with challenges. For one, it risks placing too much importance on external validation. If our sense of worth depends on how others remember us, we may find ourselves constantly striving for approval, sacrificing the present for an uncertain future. Additionally, the pursuit of immortality through memory can lead to an obsession with control, trying to shape how we are remembered, rather than focusing on living authentically. Religious and spiritual beliefs offer another way to confront this fear. Many traditions emphasize the idea of eternal remembrance, either through the concept of an afterlife or by connecting the individual to something greater than themselves. In Christianity, for example, believers find comfort in the idea that God remembers them eternally, that their lives have meaning beyond earthly recognition. Similarly, in Hinduism and Buddhism, the soul's journey through reincarnation ensures that one's essence continues, even if individual memories fade. But even without religious frameworks, there is a profound truth in how our actions ripple outward. While we may not be remembered by name, the impact we have on others, acts of kindness, wisdom shared, love given, can endure. These ripples influence future generations in ways we may never see, ensuring that our lives contribute to the ongoing story of humanity. In the end, the fear of being forgotten is a reflection of our deep desire for connection and meaning. It reminds us that we are part of something larger, that our lives are intertwined with those who came before us and those who will come after. While we may not achieve immortality in the traditional sense, the moments we share and the lives we touch ensure that a part of us remains. Perhaps the real question isn't whether we will be forgotten, but how we choose to live knowing that we might be. By embracing the fleeting nature of life, we can focus on what truly matters: love, kindness, and the joy of creating. In doing so, we find a way to transcend the fear of being forgotten, leaving behind not just a legacy, but a life well lived. Why do philosophers and poets worship death as much as they fear it? Death has always been a paradox, a source of dread and reverence, a finality that terrifies yet fascinates. For centuries, philosophers and poets have grappled with death, not merely as an end, but as an essential element of life's meaning. Strikingly, they don't just fear it, they also worship it, viewing it as a muse, a guide, and a profound mystery worthy of reverence. But why does death inspire this duality? Why do the very minds most consumed with understanding existence hold death in both awe and terror? At its core, death represents the ultimate unknown. Philosophers have long been obsessed with what lies beyond life's boundaries, crafting theories to make sense of the unknowable. For thinkers like Socrates, death was not something to be feared, but a gateway to greater knowledge. To fear death, he said, is nothing other than to think oneself wise when one is not. Socrates suggested that death might lead to either eternal rest or an afterlife of discovery. Both possibilities, he argued, were gifts. This worshipful attitude reflects the idea that death could unlock truths that life conceals. Poets, meanwhile, have often treated death as a muse, a subject of beauty and inspiration. Consider John Keats, who wrote, "When I have fears that I may cease to be," blending his dread of death with awe for its inevitability. Keats saw death not only as a threat to his creativity, but also as the very force that gave his art urgency. For poets, death sharpens life's edges, turning fleeting moments into treasures. In their hands, death becomes a mirror, reflecting the fragility and brilliance of existence. The duality of fear and worship stems from death's role as both a destroyer and a creator. On one hand, death is an end of experiences, relationships, and the self. It is the great eraser, wiping away the details of lives lived. This is why philosophers like Epicurus sought to diminish its power, famously declaring, "Death is nothing to us." To Epicurus, fearing death was irrational because we do not experience it. When we are alive, death is absent, and when death arrives, we are no longer conscious to fear it. His argument aimed to strip death of its terror, reducing it to a non-event. Yet, even those who downplay death's horror often acknowledge its power to shape life. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, revered death as a force that compels us to embrace life fully. His concept of amor fati, love of fate, urges us to accept death not as an interruption, but as a culmination. Nietzsche argued that by confronting mortality, we are freed to live authentically, making choices with the knowledge that time is finite. For Nietzsche, the worship of death was inseparable from the celebration of life. Poets, too, have embraced this interplay between death and creation. Emily Dickinson famously personified death as a gentle companion in her poem, "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." In her vision, death is neither cruel nor chaotic, but a patient guide, leading the soul toward eternity. Dickinson's portrayal suggests that by accepting death, we might find peace in its inevitability. Her work worships death, not as a fearsome force, but as an intimate, almost tender presence. Philosophers and poets also recognize that death gives life its meaning. Without an end, existence would stretch into monotony, stripped of urgency and purpose. Death creates stakes, making every decision, every connection, and every fleeting moment matter. This idea is central to existentialist thought, particularly in the works of Albert Camus. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus confronts the absurdity of life, arguing that it is precisely the inevitability of death that compels us to create meaning. He writes, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." For Camus, the worship of death lies in its power to awaken us to the absurdity and beauty of existence, forcing us to live passionately despite its impermanence. The aesthetic appeal of death also plays a role in its reverence. Poets and philosophers often find beauty in death's inevitability, seeing it as a unifying force that binds humanity. Romantic poets like Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron depicted death as sublime, a force that elevates life by contrasting it with the infinite. This view is not about celebrating destruction, but about recognizing death's role in the natural order. Just as the changing seasons bring renewal through decay, death fosters growth and transformation. Culturally, the worship of death reflects humanity's need to reconcile with its finality. Rituals, art, and philosophy offer ways to engage with mortality, transforming fear into understanding. The Mexican celebration of Día de los Muertos, for instance, turns death into a joyous occasion, a chance to honor ancestors and connect with the cycle of life. Similarly, in Buddhism, meditations on death are not morbid, but enlightening, meant to cultivate detachment and acceptance. These traditions mirror the perspectives of poets and philosophers who see death not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Ultimately, the duality of fear and worship arises because death is both an end and a beginning. It is a mystery that defies comprehension, yet it defines the human experience. By grappling with it, poets and philosophers seek to illuminate life's deepest truths. In their hands, death becomes more than an end. It becomes a force that gives life its shape, its urgency, and its meaning. So, why do they worship death as much as they fear it? Because to worship death is to acknowledge its power, to confront its inevitability, and to find within it the essence of life itself. It is a testament to humanity's resilience, creativity, and ability to find beauty in even the darkest corners of existence. In death, we find not just an end, but a mirror reflecting the profound and fragile wonder of being alive. What happens to death in a world without mortality? Imagine a world where mortality has been eliminated. Through advances in medicine, technology, or even a philosophical shift in the nature of existence, death is no longer an inevitable conclusion to life. Everyone can live indefinitely, free from the constraints of aging, disease, or physical decline. At first glance, such a world might seem like paradise, a triumph over nature's cruelest decree. But what happens to the concept of death in a world without mortality? Does it disappear, or does it take on a new, more abstract form? And how does its absence reshape the human experience? The most immediate consequence of eliminating mortality would be the erosion of death as a physical event. In a world without aging or illness, the finality of death may only occur through accidents, catastrophic events, or deliberate choice. As a result, death would become far rarer, even extraordinary. Its infrequency might strip it of its universal power, turning it into a rarity rather than a shared human experience. This would profoundly alter how societies perceive death, not as an inevitable endpoint, but as an anomaly. Without mortality, the fear of death might diminish, but its absence could create new anxieties. Much of life's meaning is derived from its finitude. Knowing that our time is limited compels us to cherish moments, pursue goals, and build relationships. If immortality removes that urgency, life might lose its intensity. With infinite time at our disposal, the significance of any one moment could diminish. Would love feel as profound if we knew it would last forever? Would creativity flourish if there were no deadline to produce? In this context, the absence of death might paradoxically lead to an existential vacuum. Interestingly, even in a world without mortality, death would likely persist in symbolic and cultural forms. It could become a metaphor for transformation or the end of certain phases of existence. For instance, people might still die to one identity to embrace another, shedding careers, relationships, or beliefs as they reinvent themselves over centuries. Death, in this sense, would evolve from a biological inevitability into a psychological or philosophical concept, and an end that gives way to a new beginning. The disappearance of mortality would also challenge many of the rituals and traditions surrounding death. Funeral rites, memorials, and other practices that help people process grief would largely vanish. However, humans might develop new ceremonies to mark transitions in an immortal life. Perhaps instead of funerals, societies would hold celebrations to honor the conclusion of specific eras in a person's existence, a symbolic death of the past self as they move forward. Religion and spirituality, which often revolve around the mystery of death and the promise of an afterlife, would also undergo profound changes. In many belief systems, death serves as a gateway to the divine or a higher state of being. Without it, these frameworks would need to adapt or risk losing relevance. Immortal beings might turn their focus from the afterlife to exploring deeper questions about purpose and transcendence in an endless existence. Would spirituality become more focused on enlightenment within life itself, rather than preparing for what comes after? But what about the darker aspects of death's disappearance? In a world without mortality, the balance between life and resources could be upended. Overpopulation might become a critical issue, straining ecosystems, infrastructure, and social systems. The lack of natural attrition could lead to a stagnation of ideas and perspectives. If the same people hold power, maintain influence, and dominate societal structures for centuries, would progress stall? Mortality forces renewal. New generations bring fresh ideas, perspectives, and energy. Without it, humanity risks becoming static, locked in an endless present. There's also the question of choice. In a world where mortality is optional, would people still choose to die? For some, immortality might become a burden, a weight too heavy to bear. The accumulation of experiences, memories, and losses over centuries could create a longing for finality. Death, once a feared inevitability, might become a sought-after release, a way to find closure in an endless existence. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger have argued that death gives life its meaning. Without it, the question of purpose becomes even more urgent. Art and storytelling, which so often draw inspiration from mortality, would also evolve in a world without death. Much of human creativity stems from the desire to leave a legacy, to create something that outlasts the creator. If people lived forever, would they still feel the need to create? Or would art shift its focus from permanence to immediacy, reflecting the changing dynamics of an eternal existence? Interestingly, the absence of death might lead to the creation of new kinds of narratives and philosophies. Humanity has always been defined by its relationship with mortality. Without it, we would need to redefine ourselves. What does it mean to be human if not to be mortal? Could we find new ways to experience meaning, connection, and fulfillment without the shadow of death to guide us? Ultimately, a world without mortality would not erase death entirely. It would transform it. Death would shift from a physical inevitability to an existential choice, a symbolic concept, or a rare event. Its absence would reshape how we live, forcing us to confront new questions about purpose, balance, and identity. In the end, death's disappearance might not solve the mysteries of existence, but deepen them. For in the absence of mortality, we would still seek meaning, urgency, and closure, those elusive qualities that death, in all its paradoxes, has always provided. Why do we keep asking questions about death that have no answers? Death is the ultimate mystery. It has confounded humanity for as long as we've existed, inspiring questions that stretch from the deeply personal to the cosmically profound. What happens after we die? Does consciousness persist? Is death the end, or is it a doorway to something else? Despite millennia of exploration through science, philosophy, art, and religion, these questions remain unanswered. And yet, we persist in asking them. Why do we keep returning to these unknowable questions, even when we suspect we'll never uncover definitive answers? At its core, the human drive to question death stems from our awareness of it. Unlike other animals, humans possess the cognitive ability to contemplate the future, to understand time, and to recognize the inevitability of our own mortality. This awareness is both a gift and a burden, setting us apart, but also filling us with existential anxiety. Questions about death arise because they are inescapable. No matter how much we try to avoid them, the reality of mortality demands our attention. One reason we continue to ask questions about death is that it forces us to grapple with meaning. If life is finite, does it have a purpose? Are our actions significant? Or is existence inherently meaningless? Philosophers like Albert Camus and Søren Kierkegaard explored these existential questions, arguing that the search for meaning is an intrinsic part of being human. Even if we cannot find definitive answers, the act of questioning helps us define our values, make sense of our experiences, and find purpose in the face of uncertainty. Religion and spirituality have long been humanity's attempt to answer the unanswerable. Most religions offer some explanation for what happens after death, whether it's reincarnation, an afterlife, or transcendence. These beliefs provide comfort, framing death as part of a larger, often benevolent plan. But even within faith traditions, questions persist. What is the nature of heaven or enlightenment? Who determines our fate? How can we be certain? These questions reflect humanity's yearning for reassurance and understanding, even when our answers are rooted in belief rather than evidence. Science, too, has entered the conversation, though it often approaches death from a different angle. Biologists and neuroscientists study what happens to the body and brain at the moment of death, unraveling the mechanisms of dying. But even with this knowledge, science cannot explain the subjective experience of death, what it feels like, if anything, to cease existing. Near-death experiences, for example, have been reported across cultures, describing tunnels of light, encounters with loved ones, and profound feelings of peace. Are these phenomena evidence of an afterlife, or are they the brain's final bursts of activity? The questions remain open, tantalizing us with the possibility of answers just out of reach. Another reason we ask unanswerable questions about death is their emotional resonance. Death is not just an abstract concept, it's deeply personal. We grieve for those we've lost and wonder about their fate. We anticipate our own deaths with fear, curiosity, or acceptance. Asking questions about death is a way of processing these emotions, of making sense of the incomprehensible. Even if we don't find answers, the act of questioning gives shape to our feelings, helping us navigate the complexities of loss and mortality. There's also a creative dimension to our questioning. Art, literature, and music have long been outlets for exploring death's mysteries. From the elegies of ancient poets to modern films about the afterlife, these works don't provide answers so much as they offer ways to engage with the questions. They create spaces where we can confront death indirectly, imagining scenarios and interpretations that help us explore our own fears and hopes. In this way, art turns unanswerable questions into a source of inspiration, transforming anxiety into expression. But why do we persist in asking questions we know we can't answer? Perhaps it's because the act of questioning itself is meaningful. Philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that thinking is an end in itself, a way of affirming our humanity. Asking questions about death is not just about seeking answers. It's about engaging with the mystery, confronting the unknown, and asserting our capacity for wonder. In a sense, the inability to answer these questions makes them more valuable. They remind us of our limitations and challenge us to embrace uncertainty as part of the human experience. Unanswerable questions about death also connect us to each other. No matter our beliefs, backgrounds, or experiences, we all face the same ultimate reality. The questions we ask about death, what happens next, how should we live knowing we will die, are universal, bridging cultural and personal divides. In asking these questions, we participate in a shared human journey, one that links us to every generation that has come before and every generation that will follow. Finally, asking questions about death reflects our insatiable curiosity. Humans are explorers by nature, driven to understand the world and our place in it. Death represents the ultimate frontier, a mystery we may never fully comprehend. The inability to find answers doesn't discourage us. It spurs us on, reminding us that the journey of discovery is as important as the destination. In the end, we keep asking questions about death because they are inseparable from what it means to be alive. These questions challenge us, inspire us, and connect us to something greater than ourselves. Whether or not we find answers, the act of asking is a testament to our resilience, our creativity, and our enduring search for meaning in the face of the unknown.